The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. They have greatly increased the life expectancy of those of us who live in advanced countries, but they have destabilized society, have made life unfulfilling, have subjected human beings to indignities, have led to widespread psychological suffering, in the third world to physical suffering as well, and have inflicted severe damage on the natural world. The continued development of technology will worsen the situation. It will certainly subject human beings to greater indignities and inflict damage on the natural world. It will probably lead to greater social disruption, psychological suffering, and it may lead to increased physical suffering, even in advanced countries. The industrial technological system may survive or it may break down. If it survives, it may eventually achieve a low level of physical and psychological suffering, but only after passing through a long and very painful period of adjustment, and only at the cost of permanently reducing human beings and many other living organisms to engineered products and mere cogs of the social machine.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
It's been time to deal.
Myth20c podcast.
Hello, welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century. Today we have an episode that is dedicated to the losers, to the overachievers, to the reactionaries, to the revolutionaries, to the misfits, to people who haven't been able to fit in, and to people who have found themselves deeply unhappy with having been able to fit in. We're going to be talking today about Ted Kaczynski, which spanned a series of 17 years. And I am joined here by, as usual, my co-host Adam.
Hey, everyone.
Hank.
Hey.
And Hans.
Hey, everyone.
So, Nick,
right.
actually, can I just make a real quick comment? That intro you did very eloquently reminded me of some of the marketing Apple used to use before Steve Jobs died. And it's really in the vein of think different. It's about taking things not for granted, but actually questioning everything that's given to you and wondering, is this actually how it's supposed to be? And is there something better we could strive for?
Is it meant to be this way, man? I mean, that's the irony isn't lost on me that we're here doing this on computer technology and making use of the internet.
Yeah, I'm aware of that as well, and it serves to kind of put our own sort of points of view into to doubt in some ways. But it's like the rationalization in my mind of why we have to use the internet to connect is our communities have been broken up, and so this is the only way we can come back together.
And that's very much to the point of what we'll be discussing today. We're going to be giving a overview of the historical facts of the case, what we can know, what we don't know, what we would hope to know. And then we're going to get into the philosophy that we find in the work attributed to Ted Kaczynski, which we had Hans reading from the intro, which is Industrial Society and Its Future. Who wants to kick off here with the facts of the case?
I'll kick off. Theodore Kaczynski, who was known as the Unabomber very quickly in the late 90s once he was apprehended by a joint task force of the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the U.S. Postal Service, was born on May 22nd, 1942 in Illinois. He was the son of Turk and Wanda Kaczynski. They raised him in a Polish Catholic neighborhood with other first and second generation Catholic Slavic immigrants, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Lithuanians, so on. When Kaczynski was around 10 years old, 10 months old, he had a severe allergic reaction. And if you watch interviews with his brother David Kaczynski and his mother Wanda Kaczynski, they assert that this was the primary mechanism for Ted's later psychological trauma, along with his encounter with Henry Murray. Post that point, Ted Kaczynski was a very remarkable young man. In the 5th grade, he underwent an IQ test and tested at 167 IQ points. Very early on, he was immensely attracted to biology and mathematics and music. Even in middle school, he was already undertaking calculus in his own spare time and didn't pay much attention to sort of teenage whimsical fantasies. He was notoriously shy around women. He didn't have many friends, and he was more of a bookworm. Curiously, when he was in high school, he was part of the math and trombone clubs and had a small sort of clique that he did belong to that was colloquially called the Briefcase Club. One of the things that the Briefcase Club did was undertake little tinkering projects, engineering projects, and at one point they even played around with developing small, very harmless explosives. By the time he was 16, Ted had already skipped several grades and made his way to Harvard University. Now, when he made his way to Harvard University, in 1958, he didn't really fit in. Every indication was that he stayed in a part of Harvard, a dorm that was primarily Northeastern WASP, and his working class Polish roots didn't really mesh well with his classmates. But he went there on a mathematics scholarship and very quickly showed promise in mathematics and engineering and biology and related subjects, but also, curiously, in philosophy. A piece in The Atlantic, written by a former classmate of his, Alton Chase, goes into some of the philosophy that Kaczynski studied in his undergrad years, including Robert Spengler and Friedrich Nietzsche, which both serve as sort of ideological.
Oswald, you're talking about Oswald Spengler, right?
Oswald Spengler, yes, Oswald Spengler, and Friedrich Nietzsche. They serve as sort of the ideological foundations in many ways for his later work. While he was in college, he was already experimenting with anti-technological notions. He was writing several small essays, and then later in his years as a master's student at Michigan, he wrote a sort of precursor to his primary essay that he had mailed home to his brother, David Kaczynski, a 23-page paper going into the problems he was already starting to see with the growing industrial landscape of America. When he went to University of Michigan after graduating from Harvard in '62, he undertook a field of mathematics known as boundary functions and, in a general sense, geometric systems analysis. One of his thesis advisors remarked that there was maybe only 10 to 12 people on the planet that could understand and appreciate his doctoral thesis on boundary functions, a field of mathematics that was actually mostly solved and proven and integrated into mainstream mathematical work not long after Kaczynski had abandoned academia. So he was not engaging in a fruitless or infinitesimal endeavor. It was real work. He was self-isolating himself during this time, and then especially when he eventually went to Berkeley. He hated the student culture of the left in the 60s. Despite having these anti-technology views, Kaczynski shied away from a lot of the student activism. And in fact, when you read his primary work, Industrial Society and Its Future, it's highly critical of leftists, and it's thought that his time dealing with these people and sort of in coming into contact with them at University of Michigan and then at Berkeley severely grew his disdain for the American left wing.
As it should.
Yeah. So when Kaczynski was still at Harvard, he came across an interesting man named Henry Murray. Now, Henry Murray was some kind of psychoanalyst for the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. And in his time there, he worked on counterintelligence and counterinterrogation techniques for OSS agents. Henry Murray was also a member of the World Federalist Movement, a elitist and kind of crypto-communist, but also just sort of strange, loose organization that's rebranded itself into the Institute for Global Policy now.
It's a world government organization.
Right. They had offices across the street from the United Nations in New York City, and they had several important ideological compatriots: Albert Einstein, Rosa Schummer, Henry Reeves, people like this. Now, Murray had a role at Harvard that was unclear. Many of the records of the Murray experiment and of just Murray's time there in general have either been quote-unquote lost or quote-unquote destroyed by Harvard for some reason. It's never been made clear. Now, some of this is known because David Kaczynski, even after turning his brother in, remained convinced that it was, in fact, Murray's experiments that made his brother into the Unabomber. And I can read from his book here. In 1967, according to the CIA's internal assessment, hundreds of college professors on more than 100 American college campuses were under secret contract to the CIA. So universities that wanted a piece of the action, including Harvard, decided to dispense with the ethical standard of informed consent that was embedded in the Nuremberg Code in response to Nazi atrocities. From 1953 to 1963, federal support for scientific research at Harvard increased from $8 million per year to $30 million per year. One secret CIA research project that used unwitting American citizens as subjects was codenamed MK Ultra. It lasted 10 years and ended in 1963, shortly after Ted had graduated from Harvard. MK3 Ultra experiments used sensory deprivation, sleep learning, subliminal projection, electronic brain stimulation, and hallucinogenic drugs to study various applications for behavior modification. One project was designed to see whether subjects could be programmed to kill on command. Experiments were conducted in penal and mental institutes on university campuses. Some hapless human subjects went crazy, and some are known to have committed suicide. The Harvard study my brother participated in was called Multiform Assessments of Personality Development Among Gifted College Men. It was overseen by the noted psychologist Henry Murray, who during World War II worked for the Office of Strategic Services, which later became the CIA, where he developed methodologies for interrogating prisoners of war. In his professional life, Murray was known for his brilliance and grandiosity. In his personal life, according to his biographer, he displayed sadistic tendencies. His research on college men there is a certain resemblance to his research on prisoners of war. He was quite a big wheel in his day, perhaps as well-known and influential in military and government circles as he was in academia. Most of the records pertaining to the Murray experiments have been destroyed or lost. There is no direct evidence that Murray experiments were funded by the CIA. However, it is clear my brother was a guinea pig in an unethical and psychologically damaging research project conducted by a team of psychological researchers who used deceptive tactics to study the effects of emotional and psychological trauma. Now, this study had 22 subjects write an essay detailing their dreams and aspirations. This is sort of the philosophy of their life, as it were. They took these students to a room, put electrodes on them to monitor vital signs, and then they had aides of Murray sit there and effectively berate them and mock them in extremely harsh ways, personal and ideological ways, about their essay and just their character. And then after these barrages of verbal attacks, the young men were made to sit and watch themselves being attacked by these aides of Murray. So Kaczynski had a particularly bad reaction, very bad reaction to this experiment. He suffered somewhat of a small mental breakdown that's revealed by some of the letters he was writing home to his parents, and that he revealed later in life. He just drove him further into isolation, and it drove him further into his total disdain for psychology and for psychoanalysis. So does this sound pretty on the par with everyone so far?
Yeah, I mean,
the 60.
Go ahead, Hank.
Like looking into the like vast amounts of mostly government-funded psychological quote-unquote research that basically amounts to sadistic torture campaigns to see what would happen is astounding once you actually start to catalog some of these things.
What you have is the application of the scientific method to humans. It was you have a technocratic elite that wants to treat the world as sort of a physics equation, and you got to crack the code of man. And the problem is that, of course, you can't do this stuff openly. You can't do it above the board. It's dangerous and obviously, by most people's standards, unethical. So that type of psychological research, which popped its head up in places like the Japanese death and torture camps of in Manchuria, places like that, where it happens in war, where you get these spooks that pop up, and they're able to, especially the torture of National Socialists after the war, treat them like guinea pigs and torture them and see the breaking point of man. I mean, this stuff all happened under the aegis of, yes, the OSS, and then later the CIA. And if you want to read, also you said the MK Ultra ended in, I think you said 1963. We don't know that that's true. They claim that. There's no reason to believe what they say. And as we see now in the current year, looking back in things like Abu Ghraib, we see that military psychological experimentation has by no means ended. It
still happens.
Program of MK Ultra, it's debatable, but there's one of the most significant books on the subject for people interested would be the former State Department guy John Mark's book, Search for the Manchurian Candidate, and this stuff came up in the 1970s church hearings. In addition to MK Ultra, you also had other things under that MK heading, like MK Naomi, which was biological weapons. Yes, they've been up to these things, and it seems like Uncle Ted, as a young, he's a child prodigy, right? I mean, this is
Right.
This is a 16-year-old kid at Harvard. I mean, he's definitely prime for the talons of these creeps. It wouldn't surprise me at all that he would be selected for something like that. And given the time period in question, it adds up very well. Yes.
I was just going to add that there have been accounts of soldiers in Iraq who have seen men in white button-down shirts go into interrogation rooms, and it's typically assumed that these are CIA officers conducting these interrogations. And of course, after hearing reports of things like Abu Ghraib, one can only guess what types of techniques they're applying to the prisoners.
Yes, there's. You gotta love those lab coats, like that white lab coat thing. I mean, you think back to the. I guess it was in the Milgram.
No, they look like office workers. That's what they look like. They don't look like soldiers, and they don't look like scientists.
Yeah, no,
either.
but I mean, just the lab coat effect. It's you go back to the Milgram experiments where
that's
the guy
a whole other rabbit hole.
It is a whole nother rabbit hole, but just the guy telling you to up the voltage there, you know. So where does his authority come from? It comes from his lab coat.
Right.
Like the substantive connection between like this particular thing, like it's a very trite analysis, I think, to say that like, anything bad that you did like must be attributable to some trauma. So like we find the trauma and like this is the thing that like we're going to sort of pin it on. So I mean, I don't know like sort of with what robustness, like obviously a lot of people have had this sort of thing happen to them around this time, and only like a half dozen of them became mass murderers.
Well, Hank, it's not to say that it's not to use the system's logic there and attribute the behavior and the actions to something that is the sort of mechanistic result of trauma. Another way of looking at it, if true that our pal here was put through such a ordeal, another way of looking at it was that he became woke to the system and to how it operates.
Oh yeah, that's a more defensible sort of interpretation.
Right. So,
real quick, I just wanted to thank. There was a $5 donation recently placed to the Patreon account, just so we didn't forget. We're not going to say the name of the person just out of privacy reasons, but you know who you are. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So one thing I would like to address, you'll see this often trotted out as a slur against Kaczynski will be that he was a failed academic. He was a failed mathematician. This is often either said by this. Part of this came up in the trial. It was never so direct, but they really tried to frame him as psychologically insane. And it's just a common epithet used against him. He had several published works in various mathematical journals in the United States. So which is
more than we can say for Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Right. This is more than we can say for Bill Nye. So another proof of Verdenberg's theorem, American Mathematical Monthly, 1964. His landmark work, Boundary Functions, Abstract of Doctoral Dissertation, was published at the University of Michigan. Boundary Functions for Functions Defined in the Disk, Journal of Mathematics and Mechanics.
I believe that was his thesis the last one.
The set of a curvilinear convergence of a continuous function defined in the interior of a cube. Boundary functions for bounded harmonic functions. Boundary functions in sets of curvilinear convergence for continuous functions. There is nothing about this man that says failed academic. This is a man who was on the tenure track at Berkeley after he completed his time at University of Michigan, and was probably the most high demand young mathematician in the United States at the time. He was the most promising young mathematician.
To speak to that further, his mentor at University of Michigan Mathematics Department, Professor George Perenian, He told reporters, quote, "I respected him very highly. I know other members of the faculty had great respect for him. I'm proud to have known him."
Right.
Keep in mind, he said this. This was in the context of the FBI charade. So he was even willing, under those conditions, to go on the record saying that he admired him from the perspective of an academic and intellectual.
You know, this reminds me, so speaking of like he's the most highly sought after mathematician, there's a fellow, I can't remember his name at the moment, but he has reportedly the highest IQ in the world. And he recently bought a farm in Missouri basically to get away from people.
Chris Langan?
That sounds about right, yeah. And he's got these really, unlike most people who are extremely talented at math, he's quite charismatic, and he actually made himself become a bodybuilder when he was younger and played in rock bands because he was sort of worried about the anti-socialization effects of sort of his talents. And so he did that, but nonetheless, he essentially has come to the conclusion that most people just are, to put it bluntly, beneath him, and he just can't deal with them. And it just sort of reminds me of kind of probably what Kaczynski was essentially going through.
This is a common problem among extremely high IQ individuals. There was a guy, I mix up his name, it's either Towers or Powers. He was bizarrely murdered in like a satanic ritual while he was working in as a bouncer in San Francisco. He wrote a paper. He was in that club of I guess like 160 and over, and he had written on the subject, and you could see it in his life itself, and his choosing to work as a nightclub bouncer.
Who was the guy who was the security guard? I mean, there was a...
I think we're talking about the same guy.
Yeah.
He might be alternatively referred to as a security guard, but it's not uncommon to see people who... I mean, the simple fact is you do not have a very large swath of people to relate to.
Right, it's very lonely.
It's lonely at the top.
Right. So he goes to Berkeley in 1967, tenure track. Within a few years, he is quitting his tenure track. The one thing that he was unsuccessful at was teaching. Part of his tenure track work at Berkeley involved having to teach classes regularly while he researched on the side. His students gave him poor reviews, said that he didn't seem interested in the subject, that he didn't offer much help, and that he didn't really care how he taught or how he presented himself in the classroom.
This reminds me of another anecdote real quick. I had a professor who was very bright, and he essentially was this guy who would write math equations over the entire board without even a use of like a word. It was basically just raw symbology. And the whole board would be covered by the end of the class. But what I remembered about him was he looked sideways at the door the whole time. He wouldn't look at the board, I mean, unless he was writing on it, and he wouldn't look at the class especially. And everybody just had the weirdest relationship with this guy. Like, nobody could really talk to him. He's very bright, but he just was totally bored by the whole subject of what he was teaching.
Yeah, that's like the modal mathematics professor. Like, there's not a whole lot. I mean, there are a few, but there's not a tremendous number of like extremely personable, well-adjusted professors who all.
What's his name comes to mind as well. The
mathematical geniuses.
The dude who was portrayed by Crow in
John Nash.
John Nash,
yeah.
Actually, more or less okay.
John Nash is a nice guy.
Yeah,
he's a wonderful guy. Was, I guess.
Yeah. So he turns in his resignation to the Berkeley Mathematics Department. They pleaded with him to stay. They couldn't understand, they understood having some trouble teaching, fine. But tremendous mathematician, you have this talent, and we're excited to see what your research leads you next. Please stay. No, I don't want to stay. He leaves. He gets together with his brother immediately thereafter and tries to purchase property in Canada, which would involve, Canadian residency and so on. He's turned down by the Canadian government and has not a nervous breakdown, but an extremely angry series of episodes because he's at this point just desperate to get away from civilization as much as possible. Eventually, his brother helps him purchase a 1.6 acre plot of land in just outside of Lincoln,
It's
Montana.
on sale, by the way, for $70,000, and I believe it's 1.4 acres.
1.4 acres, okay.
Somewhere around there, but it's very small.
Yeah, it's very small. It's very modest.
Wait, Uncle Ted's cabin is for sale?
Not the cabin. The cabin sits in Washington,
The
D.C.
cabin is under federal protection in a
It's a museum, I think.
in one of those vaults that they have like the Ark of the Covenant next to it.
Well, they auctioned it off, and I think a museum in D.C. bought it. And then
really?
I think Kaczynski said he didn't want it there. I don't know if they tried to respect his wishes, quote unquote, and took it out.
Well,
that was the original plan.
Victims of the Unibombings wanted it destroyed. It was the whole. We can get into that, I guess, a little more later. But the whole incident with the cabin was pretty interesting, considering it was conducted like at midnight in '96. They had a flatbed truck they loaded it up on, and they took it to an Air Force base and kept under 24-hour guard.
But to clarify, the plot of land is what I was referring to before. That's what's on for sale. Last I checked.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So he buys this plot of land just outside of Lincoln, Montana, and builds his own cabin. It's effectively just one giant room, has no running water, no electricity. He had a small cot. He had one of the walls was entirely just made of shelves. Effectively kept later on all his bomb making components, but books.
Well, we don't know about the bomb making components. We do know that there were 296 books, though. We do know that because we can independently corroborate that fact.
He had an immense amount of books. He had an old typewriter.
I'm sorry to burst your bubble. We also can't corroborate. These are things that the FBI did not allow to be accessed by anyone else, local authorities or what have you. Typewriter was sensitive material, considering that was the device that was allegedly the so-called manifesto was written on. But do go on. I have to throw that out because that will come up later and is important.
So he
Nick, let me just ask real quick. I mean, if you think that this is all sort of fake, why didn't Kaczynski...
I didn't say I think it's fake. I didn't say that.
Okay.
I said that here you have a suspect who is put through a railroaded investigation, and key pieces of evidence such as typewriter and bomb making material were not allowed to be seen by anyone other than FBI.
Okay. Sure, I agree. That's
their entire existence is simply something alleged by the FBI. It's not.
That's suspicious.
Yeah.
Well, I had a real quick question.
And furthermore, here, let me give you something on this point before we go on. He had visitors to the cabin who didn't see anything of the sort. There was a.
Well, there were 2 floors, I believe. So who knows where he
were there
had
2
it.
floors?
No, it was one. It was one.
He had an attic though. I'm sure he used it for something. It's pretty small. Otherwise, there was, I thought, a ladder to go up there. I mean, I looked at pictures, and one thing I was curious about is that the walls seem to be made of like 2x4s. In Montana, it gets pretty cold in winter, and I don't think he left the cabin. And so I think he had a chimney, so that implies he had a fire. But
he had a stove.
Good God, that's got to be cold during the winter.
Yeah.
Yeah, he had a neighbor, Gene Yodarian, who had visited it, and he had nothing of note to say. There was nothing fancy, and no tools were visible either. The FBI claimed that in the cabin, so that they were on display in addition to the typewriter and the other tools and stuff, in addition to the wood stove, platform bed, table, chair, clothing, and I'm sorry, I had the number wrong, 239 books.
Right. So he has this small cabin, very modest life. He has a bicycle that a neighbor gives him. And he grows a small vegetable garden. He goes out into the wilderness to hunt for game, chop down trees for wood, and so on.
Well, specifically, he hunted for rabbits. And I just get into this, details because it tells you a lot about how he actually pulled this stuff off. he didn't hunt
You
big
mean
game.
living? When you say pull this stuff off, you mean how he lived?
That's exactly what I mean. Yeah, but thanks for
Okay,
clarifying. So, how does he survive in this really remote location? And hunting is hard. I mean, you get better at it obviously if you do it more, but you have to travel quite a bit to get game. And I'm wondering if he used traps, because the small game. I mean, did he have rifles? I mean, that's the other thing. It's like he would have a limited supply.
I
of
have
these
seen
things.
no reports of any guns.
He had a homemade gun.
He had a homemade
allegedly.
handgun, apparently.
Yeah.
Right.
Homemade handgun. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would assume if he's hunting rabbits, he's probably doing it with traps. No, I mean, it's probably the reasonable assumption.
So it's a lot easier that way, but that's why. Because I mean, if he wasn't, you would probably need a 22 or something like that.
You need a 20. Yeah, you need a 22.
So the timeline from here gets a little shaky, because Ted is keeping very sparse contact with his brother and his parents in the outside world. The occasional letter back and forth, so on. At one point, he tries to convince his brother, who then later somewhat undertakes this venture, to go live out a similar sort of Henry David Thoreau lifestyle in the Texan desert, effectively. But his brother gives up and goes home. Ted eventually kind of abandons the nomad life for a very small amount of time. He goes back to the Chicago area, lives at his parents' house, and gets a job at the foam rubber factory that his brother was a supervisor at. And things go well for Ted. He's working. He's being sociable with his parents and his brother. And he meets a coworker, a female coworker at this company, and they start dating for a while. Things go sour at some point, and David Kaczynski, his brother, is forced to fire him because of his weird kind of behavior towards the female employee. This was the last time until the trial, I believe, that Ted and David saw each other. So not long after this, Ted Kaczynski is believed to have sent his first bomb. So the details of this are somewhat peculiar. A little package is found at the University of Illinois parking lot, and a security guard finds it. Or someone finds it in the parking lot, hands it to the security guard. And says, what is this? The security guard name is Terry Marker, and the bomb exploded. It was a very very small bomb. These were made out of essentially a small wooden box, wooden dowels, lamp cords, and batteries. Very, very, and metal screws. Very, very small explosive. Didn't really do much damage. Slightly burned the security guard's hands, and the incident was just chalked up to a prank, effectively, because it wasn't even third-degree burns. Not long later, next year, a man named John Harris at Northwestern University finds a bomb, or finds a small package similar in architecture to the previous, explodes, hurts his hands a little. Now, Kaczynski wasn't even living at his cabin again yet. He was still traveling around Illinois, or at least that's what they believe. That at this time he was delivering these things by hand. He was just placing them on the ground or wherever for people to find, and then leaving the scene. This is before prevalence of CCTV cameras. This is really advanced ones that are constantly recording. This is before an era of terrorism and heightened awareness. There's security guards everywhere, so he was able to pull this off and never be seen. No one ever saw him doing this, and people never thought to question an upstanding looking man who just put something on the ground and walked away. Later that year, two things happen. Kaczynski is fingered for knocking down a power line in the Stemple Pass area by just taking a wooden axe and literally chopping down the power. And then this is where the FBI manhunt starts to begin. On November 15th, he places a bomb on an American Airlines 727 cargo to explode mid-flight. So it was American Airlines 444 heading towards Washington, D.C.
Now, how did he get the bomb on the aircraft? It's not like you can just walk in there. So did he like send it through the parcel service, or what was the system?
Yeah, so there's still somewhat unclear. He's never fully admitted to this point. It's believed that he either did one of two things. He snuck it onto luggage, checked the luggage in as if he was getting on the flight, and then never got on the flight.
But is there a record of that? I mean, they have to keep records of these things, don't they?
I mean, yeah, that is part of FBI evidence that, to my knowledge, has not been released. It's still not clear how exactly this bomb was put on
this, and maybe you can answer it as you go through the examples. But I'd really like to know this, because if this was, even if it was just one isolated incident, I didn't. If I'm an FBI agent, right, and I don't assume that these are connected, I would still try to trace the source of these things. And so, especially if it's through the mail, you should be able to go back. The post office must have these records of whatever transfer stations these things go to, and you can find where it was dropped off, at least, even if it's with a fake name. And so then you can try to correlate, okay, is it coming from a common place? Because I can't imagine Ted was driving around the United States to like mail things. That just seems too impractical. But I'm curious about how he did it.
That's what's sort of what he's been accused of. So we'll get into his supposed tactics that he allegedly used in order to obfuscate his exact location. Now, this bomb caught the FBI's attention because of how intricately it was designed, in particular, the barometric switch that was used. So the bomb was wooden box, lamp cords, batteries, wooden dowels, metal screws, and a barometric switch with a container for the explosive charge, so that when the pressure of the cabin hit a certain point, they would then flip the switch, or close the switch, and this sort of altitude-sensitive barometric switch would cause the bomb to explode. Now, it was effectively just elastic bands and match heads. It wasn't very advanced at all. But the bomb did not explode as intended. It essentially just caught on fire, burned some of the luggage in the compartment, filled the cabin with smoke, plane did an emergency landing. Turns out it was just a bad sealing on part of the container for the explosive charge that caused this to malfunction. Had Ted not made that mistake, that bomb would have likely blown a hole in the underside of the plane and killed everyone on board. The plane would have crashed.
It makes you wonder as well why it is that upon perfecting his methodology of bombing, he didn't return to the possibility of taking one of those instruments of the techno future right out of the sky.
Right.
Did you say that this was a cargo vessel, not a passenger jet with some cargo underneath it with in the empty spaces?
It was the cargo hold. It was a 727. So it was full cabin.
The reason I ask is because if it's a passenger jet, obviously there's a lot more people on board, so it's not necessarily the technology he's going after. And I don't know. I can't really profile this guy. I mean, this is another question I had about how they kind of profiled him, but he doesn't strike me as a guy who's trying to kill a lot of people. He's trying to make a point about technology.
Right. So
maybe he backed off. I mean, maybe he had second thoughts about killing a bunch of people like that.
I mean, so part of it was personal. Like, we know from his diaries that one of the things he hated the most were airplanes flying over his is the backwoods of the backwoods of Montana. He was very much almost infatuated with the nature surrounding him, but suddenly he would notice small things that would distract from that, including airplanes that would fly over and make noise. So this is part of the impetus, as it's thought, for him going after and just deciding to try and blow up a plane. The FBI gets very involved very quickly, because suddenly that small mistake is the only thing preventing an entire plane full of people from dying. And this is where the name Unabomb comes from, University Airline Bomb.
And at this point, did this make the news? I mean, when did Unabomber come about, and was this even reported, as an incident? Because the airline might want to cover it up. It was
reported as an incident. So at this point, they were starting to make connections between the bombings at university campuses and this bomb, just based on similar design. One of the things they noticed was this impeccable wood carving skills for the wooden boxes used for these bombs.
But what I'm asking is, was it reported to the press? Because it obviously was reported to the FBI, but did they want that leaked to the public?
That I'm not sure at that point. I mean, the press was obviously covering the incidents, but I don't think that the press knew the term.
I mean, a lot of planes make emergency landings, I think. So that's not really a headline unless they think it's a bomb. That's a headline. But I'm wondering, did they report on this? I don't know.
I couldn't tell you. But not long after the attempted destruction of the plane, Mr. Kaczynski is been blamed for going after the United Airlines president, Percy Woods. So Percy Woods gets a package in the mail one day with a small letter saying that it's of great social and political significance. Doesn't say who it's from. He opens it. It's a book. It's Ice Brothers. And there's a small little bookmark or something sticking out. And so he opens to that part of the book. And instantly, bomb explodes. Doesn't kill him, but he's pretty badly injured. There's a ton of shrapnel from the weapon placed inside the book. And at this point, this is where the insignia FC starts showing up. So Kaczynski would put small pieces of metal with FC stamped into the little trinket as a sort of calling
One
card.
of the speculations on behalf of the FBI was that it stood for "fuck computers."
Well, the FBI profile at this point, after he bombs the airline, or the airliner, and then the president of this airline company, is that this is a disgruntled aeronautics engineer or a disgruntled mechanic. They assume that someone who had knowledge of building a bomb to trigger when the pressure of the cargo hold hit a certain point had to have intimate knowledge of aeronautical engineering.
That is pretty basic physics. Why do you need...
Right. So the FBI, not exactly the brightest bulbs in the room at this point, or at any point, just completely botch this. They create this really goofy profile. So they assume it's someone currently at a university or someone who was recently at a university in the 20s or 30s. Ted is almost in his 40s by this point. Who worked in the airlines at some point or had a background in aeronautical engineering, and was involved in radical student activism. These are just things they assumed.
I mean, it's a guess. To be fair, honestly, this is nearly impossible, frankly, when you're living in a nation of hundreds of millions. I mean, come on. You need a lot of data, and this is before, really advanced machine learning and stuff, and it's it's not easy. It's not easy. So, and they couldn't even figure it out. At the end, it was his brother, but I'll let you go though.
Right. So after that, there's a string of bombings every few months. So in '81, there's a bomb in a classroom at the University of Utah, Salt Lake City. Nothing really happens. Bomb goes off, no one's really injured. And then in '82, the next bomb, Janet Smith, a secretary, is injured when there's a bomb that explodes. Is addressed to a computer science professor at the university. She survives, just sort of minor injuries. At this point, these bombs are still not doing a lot of damage. They create shrapnel. They burn your hands. Maybe they give you temporary vision problems. Severely, I would say severely underwhelming bombs. They're more of a nuisance. There's the plane bomb that scared the FBI the most, but then Ted immediately goes back to these small individual pipe bombs that don't do much to anyone.
Assuming it was Ted.
Assuming it was Ted, right? And then later, about a month later, Berkeley. And this is not addressed to Freedom Club. There was no FC trinket found. Nothing related to FC found. But it's assumed it was him. Professor of electrical engineering and computer science is injured at the faculty lounge at the University of California, Berkeley. So what happened was he walks in, finds this strange-looking thing on the ground of the lounge. It was some weird mechanical contraption. It just looked totally bizarre. It didn't make sense. So he walks over, he picks it up off the ground. Bomb explodes, knocks him over, injures him kind of badly, but not life-threatening. Not life-threatening at all. And then there's this weird gap of time where about 3 years when nothing happens. They're not receiving any word from him or from the FC. They're not receiving any new bomb reports. But what the FBI and the Postal Inspection Service start doing is investigating what exactly these bombs are made of, what exactly or how they're being made. So what they're finding very quickly is that the postal stamps being used are homemade. And what they're finding is that the packages and the stamps have been treated with a chemical so that fingerprints don't take to them. So they assumed he would obviously use gloves or glue on his fingers or whatever to avoid himself. But he coats the packages and the stamps and everything in this chemical so that postal workers' fingerprints don't get on the bombs. So it's impossible to even construct a basic supply line of how this thing worked its way through the postal system.
That's not exactly true. I think the Postal Service, now maybe not at that point, but I believe that, well, certainly since computers have been around, they track every transfer.
No. But I mean, at this point, they couldn't tell which postal workers touched the bomb at what time. This is still in like the early 80s.
Yeah, but it's typically they're assigned routes, so it surprises me they can't determine that.
I mean, later on, like one of the things the FBI has acknowledged, the reason they attribute them taking so long to catch him is that they just had inadequate operational and technological capabilities to recordize anything.
Now that is some rich fucking irony right there.
Right. Yeah, they still make that argument too. They don't have enough money. We need more resources.
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
Very good point, Adam. Yeah, I mean, they attribute that. I think
it's a classic excuse. It's the classic excuse. We're not funded well enough. Mm-hmm. That's why we fucked up. It's not even. I'm not even blaming them. It's just
not about you, Hans. I would second what Adam is saying, and there's something a little dubious about sort of one of the most tightly controlled instruments of the system, the original instrument of the system, the fucking Postal Service. Like, I think that I think if they I think it's worth saying that if they wanted to, they might have been able to find what they were looking for.
So sometimes he would, if he didn't make his own stamps, he would use old stamps that had been issued like several years prior, and then he would have like the priority mail label. So he was taking small steps to obfuscate just the nature of the package. Furthermore, the FBI believes that his general trend was he would ride his bike into Lincoln, Montana, with a pack of clothes and other items in tow. From Lincoln, Montana, take a bus to Missoula, Montana, and then from Missoula, Montana, take a bus to wherever. Salt Lake City, the Bay Area, Chicago, or wherever he felt like going. Sometimes he would take it to other intermediary locations and drop the package off there. He would always make sure to shave, clean himself up, and put on a suit before leaving the whatever location he stayed at the motel in. His departure from from Missoula, Montana. So he took good care, for the most part, to ensure that he was just a normal person. Tried to blend in. At this point, they're also finding that the bombs they're using as soldering wire, copper wire, lead pipes, and springs, along with typically 4 9-volt batteries bound together. Now, he would also scrape off labels of the batteries. Couldn't even tell what brand they were. He would manufacture as many of these materials as he could, or he would just use old things he'd find, antiques or whatever, strip them apart, components, use those for his bombs, whether it was bombs he actually sent people or bombs he used for testing new explosive methods. Effectively, he took every step to create several layers of disconnection between him and the actual packages that would arrive and hurt people. Assuming, again, that this was actually Ted Kaczynski. One of the things they also started to notice is that bombs were coming in clusters. So 1 through 4 were all in the sort of Chicago Northwestern University area. 5 was in Salt Lake. 6 was then obviously in Tennessee. But then from that point on, you have a huge cluster in the Bay Area. 7, 8, 11, 13, and 16. And then 12 again or number 12 in Salt Lake. 14 and 15 in the tri-state area of Connecticut, New Jersey, and New York, and then a single lone bomb up in Auburn, Washington. But for the most part, over the course of this supposed bombing career, he tried to either cluster up and then at some point branch out to a new area.
Was that last one in Washington at the Boeing engineer? I believe somebody from Boeing got bombed.
Yeah, Auburn. Yeah, tried to kill someone from Boeing.
So let's break a few things down for our listeners that are, I guess, a bit younger. You'd have to have been. I mean, this was taking place. The bombings themselves were taking place throughout the 80s, and the trial and the sort of the memeing of it, the Unabomber, that was more of a mid 90s. The trial itself was 96, I believe. Is that correct, guys?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he was arrested 95. So
95, yeah. Okay, so how many? You list off number. How many bombings were we dealing with, Hans?
16.
16 bombings total. And how many fatalities from these bombings? If I recall, it was around 3.
3.
Yes. And you list a number of places: Illinois, Bay Area, California, Washington, Boeing facility. Is any more states to include there?
Yeah, you said New Jersey, I think, somewhere.
New Jersey, Connecticut, one time in Michigan, and then one time in Tennessee, as well as two in Utah.
Okay, and then
where was the airplane taking off from? Do you remember?
The third one, it was taking off from Chicago.
Okay.
From Chicago. And the places, the institutions and targets that were hit. We have, if I recall, one of the fatalities was at a computer electronics store.
Yes, that is in 85. That's in Sacramento.
Okay. And the there were a couple at public universities, University of California, Berkeley, and what were the others?
Northwestern University.
That's right. Yeah, Northwestern.
And then also just typically mailed things to people's homes
and
offices.
Private residences and offices.
Yeah.
The two other casualties, where were those?
Later on, those are in Sacramento.
Fatalities.
Fatalities, right. So North Caldwell, New Jersey, and then Sacramento again.
What were those? Were those private residences, the both of them?
So North Caldwell, New Jersey, and this is where the bombing gets really gruesome. At this point, Ted has, this is way after, actually, let's give some quick history on how his bombs get so powerful. After he kills a man in Sacramento, a computer store owner, he effectively just left a suspicious-looking package in this man's parking lot. Man goes over, takes off the lid or this thing, or turns it over, explodes, fragmentation, and kills him. Although he didn't die immediately, he bled out on the back door or the back steps of his shop. And then
now, is that typical from a bomb, or were there fragments in the bomb? I'm not sure exactly how that works. You may not know the details.
I mean, so there's both. So the components used, the wooden screws, some of the other things he would put in, like later on he was putting in razor blades and other stuff.
Jeez.
But also the wood from the the casing itself would also create.
And were these all pipe bombs? I mean, obviously the pipe is going to be a big shrapnel device.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hank, do you want to jump in on the explosive power here of the pipe bomb?
I'm not familiar. Like, I don't think that his designs are like super detailed in their public presentation.
No.
But I will say that, like, based on sort of your standard, like, I believe he was using black powder, correct?
Yeah, he was using black powder, and then later on he starts using other material. Starts to really freak out the FBI.
So, I mean, like, yeah, like a pipe bomb will definitely kill somebody. It'll kill them by throwing shrapnel and probably causing them to either to bleed to death or to get an unlucky blast that goes through their eye or something. But, like, generally, like, as the Weather Underground and many other actors have discovered, like, bombs are really finicky things, especially if you're sort of averse to complicated electronics. So, like, you know, it's one questions what exactly he thought that he was trying to accomplish, even in sort of the individual sort of like technicalities of the target. Like, well, you have to ask whether he actually, like, obviously there was reckless disregard for if he was killing people, but was that, like, sort of the actual goal? Was the thought process behind, like, sending a mail bomb as a mechanism of killing somebody?
So,
I'll just throw. Really quick. Yeah, go ahead, Hans.
The evidence the FBI threw at him particularly for the computer store owner. So I forgot to mention, by this point, he had actually already abandoned black powder. He was using aluminum powder and sodium nitrate. He had moved from match heads, smokeless powder, and then aluminum powder and sodium nitrate. The FBI used his journals, his supposedly handwritten journals that he kept in his cabin against him, because after the news came out that this computer store owner had died, he wrote allegedly, I've finally found a humane way of killing someone, quote unquote.
Where did he write in the journals? Is where they allege he wrote this, as
right.
well as keep going.
That's pretty much it. I mean, it's not known if he thought this was going to kill this man, but after it did, The FBI alleges he acknowledges that it killed this man and that he was going to then use this technique going forward.
I mean, here's what's odd to me. Like, the motivation of doing this to get his message out made more sense to me than he just wants to kill random people.
Right.
But if he was doing this, you think he could have left a note in the package itself.
Yes, you would think that, as well as you would think that at his trial, which if you all would like to start on, we could get into, he abdicated his opportunity to explain himself in any great detail.
That may have been part of the deal he had to make, though. So just keep that in mind.
That's one explanation, as well as the likelihood that he was on some kind of medication. They had drugged him.
Well, let's get to that when we get to the trial, because
I'd like to bring up his brother before we get there.
He would not have had that opportunity regardless.
Okay.
So,
we can get into that more when we get to the trial, but the concern still stands as to the relationship. We're about to be shown in layer half of this. We're going to get into detail into the document and the ideas, the ideology of Ted, and of the, probably more delicately put, the Freedom Club ideology.
right.
We're not really seeing in these series of bombings the commonality of targets that we do see are people involved in the industrial production process of aeronautics.
It's literally everybody.
But more symbolically so. I mean, Boeing more so than an eraser factory or whatever. I mean, what were the targets? They were IBM, Boeing. I mean, we're talking the.
But it's a lot of dispersion in there. Like, I mean, a guy who owns a computer store. Like,
yeah, well, that's why it gets confusing. We don't. That's what we're being told, that this is a struggle against technological society, and then yes, you have a few academics and a dude who owns like a computer store getting blown away.
But he also wrote that manifesto. At least he doesn't deny that in his writings. It seems like that's him. So that theory makes some sense to me.
Yeah, but when did they present him with the entirety of what they put out? Like, there's some confusion here, because I would agree he probably wrote it, but there are a few things in there that could have been added, I will say.
That could be true. It just seems like an unlikely narrative for, quote unquote, this system to put out there, because it's very anti-system. Right. Maybe you don't think it is. Maybe you think it's like a way to get people to do something stupid so that they get rolled up. But who knows? You can go into a million.
Well, we can get into this. But as for the industrial production process, Hank, I mean, you're right. I mean, if the bombing was not to actually halt production. I mean, it wasn't.
Yeah, like, it's the dumbest. Like, you're talking about lab managers who, like, literally are only responsible for channeling money from one place to another. Like, people who are sort of in managerial administrative positions. Like, I mean, he really should have known from his experience in academia, like, how few people are actually doing serious work on particular sections of science and technology.
You would think that, but remember how young he was when he was there, and how short a period of time he was there. I mean, he really was not integrated in society in so many ways. He just was recognized as a genius. He was sort of planted
even when
in these
Hank
places.
even talks about in the manifesto.
This is sort of a higher level thing. Like, the fact that, like, something like his choice of targets doesn't make a whole lot of sense doesn't necessarily make you less confident in, like, the sort of baseline explanation if every other somewhat plausible explanation is equally as unsatisfying.
I agree with that.
Explaining that factoid. So, I mean, like, even if, like, say, put on your like 16 layers of tinfoil, say that the whole thing is an op. Like, do you think the FBI or the CIA or, like, agencies that we don't have acronyms for can't find, like, a better target of their ire than, like, computer store owner? Like, it's sort of
Well, it's in many ways it's advantageous that you're not actually causing real damage to Boeing or whatever. What you have achieved is an interstate bombing campaign.
Now you've gone through like so many layers of recursion that like actually like.
No, I would never. I personally would never make the claim that they were responsible for all of these bombings. First, one question we would have to answer first is: are these bombings all connected?
Well, that's obviously the main one that I had. I mean, it's like, how do you know that he did them all? I mean, they're not all techno.
How do you know that they're all part of the same thing? Is there proof of that? Is that in the forensics of it? Is there?
Well, yeah. I mean, like it's possible for even one actor to have multiple motivations. It's also possible.
You can link the FC thing pretty easily, but the other ones maybe not so much.
But they were all. This is just a question of fact. Were they all? Did all of them contain?
I don't think
this
not
marking.
all of them. Not all of them.
I was pretty sure. Yeah. Okay. So one more thing I would bring up. I'm sure most of the listeners are familiar with the Luddites.
Sure.
Right.
And what they would do. I mean, it was the goal was the actual machinery itself, and Ted has been called a neo-Luddite. And again, back to Hank's. I mean, you would think that the goal would be something, if it was symbolic first and foremost, would not the symbolism be better rather than the person who operates the machine, who is ostensibly the object of liberation? Wouldn't it be the machine itself?
You could. This gets into his philosophy.
Get into the philosophy.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
a good question though. Why don't you remember that for later?
Right. So he after killing this man, Hugh Scruton, in Sacramento, goes effectively quiet about a year and a half, and then he shows up in Salt Lake City, another computer store, places a wooden device in an empty parking lot, walks away. A couple hours later, allegedly, a man who owned a store there gets up, drives up to this thing, kicks it, explodes, and it severely injures him, and it causes permanent nerve damage to one of his arms. Now, this is where the infamous Unabomber sketch comes from. Man in the Ray-Ban, or the big sunglasses, the hood, and the mustache with the curly hair coming out underneath. I don't know about you guys, but that really doesn't look a lot like Ted. Never really has.
I always thought that too, but I've never seen him at an older age without the beard. And to give the sketch artist credit, he actually did capture some of his chin and some of the other details. And basically, if you put on a hood, you change your facial hair, you wear glasses, even computers today have a hard time matching you up with accuracy. So it's
well, let's talk a little bit about that. That sketch, the sketch was provided by an FBI forensic artist, Jeannie Boylan, and the female witness who provided those details could not identify Kaczynski as the man that she saw in 1987.
That's interesting.
For the record there, guys.
I mean,
So-
you make any attempt to disguise yourself, and that brief flash of sort of seeing someone, like eyewitness testimony, is pretty darn unreliable, even under perfect conditions.
Yeah.
Sure. But that's the extent of our Kaczynski witnesses, physical Kaczynski witnesses.
So at this point, Ted effectively goes underground. He stops his bombing campaign. The sketch that was made available to the public really freaks him out, allegedly. He also has a couple bad winters in Montana, climate doesn't treat him well. And he focuses more on his philosophical work, on reading, on new bomb making techniques, and on farming. He builds his own garden, more trapping, so on.
A real human being.
Right. And at this point, he's getting older. He's starting, he's slowing down. He's not getting a great amount of nutrition every day. So he's just not doing as well anymore. This 6-year hiatus almost killed the case. There were a few FBI agents who had been on the case for the entirety of, or since the first bombing, or the third bombing, that is, who were convinced he was still out there, although the FBI fundamentally believed that he had killed himself, given up, or had an accident with bomb making.
But again, at this point, what makes them think it's one guy when
I was going to ask
is as an organization?
There's always like if there is a successful bombing campaign, like the difficulty is such that there's almost always one guy making the bombs, because otherwise your bomb makers rapidly blow themselves up.
Okay, so simply there were no bombs going off in the United States.
Yeah, but then there's a distinction between the hunt for the bomb maker and then the hunt for the political,
Sure.
the whatever political radical group,
whatever accomplices or whatever.
Right.
But like if you sort of like identify like one coherent bombing campaign, there's almost always going to be like one guy doing the technical.
Right, but the Weather Underground, obviously, so if they had one bomb maker, the hunt would be for the communist bombers.
Sure.
So there's this long quiet period, the FBI. Right in 1987, actually, after the 2 computer store bombings, the Unabomber Task Force was given extra funding, and they called him the most dangerous man in America. And goes quiet. Doesn't send any letters, doesn't communicate at all. Out of the blue, 1993, Charles Epstein is a geneticist, and he receives a small little envelope to his house in California. The envelope explodes and nearly kills him. It was filled with a really weird chemical concoction. It effectively created like this hot gas. It exploded in his face and gave him pretty severe life-threatening injuries. After this, there's another bomb about 2 days later to Professor David Gelernter. Now, David Gelernter has actually been in the news recently. He is a pro-Trump Jewish computer scientist, curiously enough.
Interesting.
Yeah. So he was a computer science professor at Yale. Received an almost identical package to the one that hit Epstein at his house in New Haven, Connecticut. Blows up, injures him severely. Now, at this point, they're able to trace where the packages had at least come from initially, or more recently. That was from Sacramento, California. So their belief is that the bombs were mailed from that point after Kaczynski had taken a complex bus route to Sacramento, mailed the bombs, and then left. A year later, in 1994, Thomas Moser opens a small little parcel delivered to his house in North Caldwell, New Jersey. This bomb was particularly powerful. At this point, Kaczynski had started using, again, the aluminum powder and sodium nitrate. He is packing these parcels full of razor blades and extra nails and other pieces of lead to create additional shrapnel. And this bomb is effectively a pipe bomb within a pipe bomb. It explodes right in front of Mr. Moser, who was the New York advertising, and it kills him. The bomb is so powerful that it blows a hole open in his chest, exposing his heart. So the FBI realizes very quickly that not only is the Unabomber returned with the signature FC trinkets and everything, but that clearly his bomb-making capabilities have grown very powerful. 4 months after that, Gilbert Murray, who was the president of the California Forestry Association, had a little parcel open to his house, or not sorry to his house, his association's office, and it was actually addressed to his predecessor, William Dennison. Bomb exploded and practically decapitated Murray because of how powerful it was, using the same design that he used for the Moser bombing. Now, about 2 months later, the New York Times and the Washington Post receive a 35,000-word manifesto and a demand that if this is not published as soon as possible, the bombing would continue. This is, of course, the manifesto we know as Industrial Society and its future. The New York Times and the Washington Post both want to publish it. The FBI is severely against it initially, and then realizes that they have spent almost $50 million over the course of this investigation for 17 years. Had no concrete leads, had over time 2,400 suspects, and at that point, it's actually known that none of these suspects, of the 2,400 suspects or the 35,000 people they talked to in connection with the Unabombing case, were ever Ted Kaczynski or any of his family members. So the FBI was desperate. They didn't want to encourage him, but they didn't know how else to catch him. So the Washington Post publishes it on September 9th, 1995, the full manifesto. Pretty much every page of the newspaper is just page after page after page of the manifesto. In fact, you can still go see the, at least online, the easiest available source for reading the manifesto is on the Washington Post website, curiously enough. Although I would recommend that you undertake some informational security, some VPN or maybe a Tor browser before visiting the Washington Post edition of the manifesto.
Let's get into his trial, and so we can then get into that manifesto.
Well, so here's how he gets caught. This is effectively how he gets caught. Privately, David Kaczynski and his wife had read the manifesto in the paper, and David's wife encouraged him to see if this was perhaps Ted. Now, David Kaczynski has claimed repeatedly that he couldn't believe it. He refused to believe it. And then eventually his wife convinced him to read through some of the letters Ted had sent him over the years. And they compared the letters to the manifesto. They found similar phrases. Then David Kaczynski conspicuously finds a 23-page essay that his brother had written in college and mailed to him with very similar themes, very similar talking points as the final manifesto. David Kaczynski has all of this submitted to a private linguistic analysis that gives a high degree of confidence that the person who wrote the letters and the person who wrote the initial paper, 23-page paper, and the manifesto are the same person. And this was actually the crux of the FBI's case later, was the linguistic analysis. On April 3rd, 1996, the rural cabin of Ted Kaczynski is raided by the FBI.
I'd like to make a quick note before you get into that. Ted's brother, David, actually went to the FBI, from what I understand. And the reason I bring this up is because there was I haven't seen it. I'm just reading this stuff off of IMDb, but according to one of the episode descriptions of the show Manhunt Unabomber 2017 to, I guess they're going to, try to make this carry on for as long as they can sell it. It chronicles the FBI's search for this guy, and they make it kind of like the main character of the show is this guy named Fitz. I assume that's the real name of the agent, and he's basically the guy who's kind of fighting against the system. And you guys need to understand, and you should publish, this manifesto, because that'll give us some clues as to who this guy is. That may all be true, but what I don't like about the description I'm reading here is that Fitz receives linguistic proof that Ted is the Unabomber and tracks down Ted's brother David. That's the opposite of what happened.
Right.
This is on IMDb, and so I have two questions. Why is this coming out now? And two, it's sort of obvious to me, but why are they making the FBI the hero here? So I'll leave it at that.
Because I think that, look, the dissident right sphere, let's call it the outer right, as I think the two Kevins sometimes call it, has taken up a lot of interest in Kaczynski and has propagated his work to a huge extent over the last 2 years. I don't think that them putting out this series is coincidental. I think that a lot of people
I didn't think so either.
I think a lot of people are seriously reconsidering Ted's work. And I think a lot of people are seriously reconsidering that perhaps he was a murderer. Perhaps he made mistakes. But at the core of his philosophy, his ideology, was he right? I had a conversation with actually someone in NRX a couple nights ago about this. And he said, he had read a while back on Chateau Artiste, a pretty good right-wing blog, that Ted Kaczynski was effectively a fallen prophet who understood the system at an immense level, really understood it from the inside out, but made a series of tactical errors. If you're working with the mainstream story, made a series of tactical errors that undermined his critiques and ruined his life. And if he had taken something like the Noam Chomsky approach, he could have had a lot more success.
That's an interesting take. I will give some little disclaimer and say that I am unconvinced that Ted is a singular bomber masterminding this for years. I have my own theory, I think, about what happened, but his work should be treated carefully. It shouldn't. You don't want to get memed. You don't want to get memed into something that you're not. I'll just say.
Yeah. Anyways, I don't think that it's coincidental. I think that them trying to frame the FBI as not being totally incompetent throughout the entirety of this case and not knowing anything about this man.
Or just not effective. Like I said before, you just have these series of random events and you sort of see somewhat of a pattern, but I'm not saying I could do any better than they did. If we assume all the facts that they present are true.
Right.
But yeah, the results are abysmal. The return on $50 million is effectively zero because the brother basically solved the case.
Well, I'll just put on the table what I speculate might be going on here that is not being addressed. Ted was involved with at the time you had the radical, the equivalent. You had two groups. You had on the right and on the left two groups that were coming to reject the system on the most fundamental level, that they didn't want anything to do with it in their personal lives. They didn't want to depend on it economically. So you had sort of the compound mindset right wingers, and you see in the Weavers at Ruby Ridge, or even at Waco, Texas, for instance. And the FBI's approach to dealing with that was what we know, and I believe we did discuss in the FBI episode. It was the PatCon project, the Patriot conspiracy, and it was applying the principles of the older counterintelligence operation against the left, known as COINTELPRO, to the right. So setting people up, with agent provocateurs, and getting organizations roped into specific acts of specific criminal acts that could be used to shut them down, as well as, of course, the media propaganda element of it all.
So the 90s, we have Waco, we have the Oklahoma City bombing, McVeigh, and we have, I think from Covington's brief history of white nationalism, several kind of Aryan Brotherhood or white.
The Order was,
Robert
I think,
Matthews. You have the Order.
The Order was the 80s, right. I believe, but it was
the 80s,
Ruby
but
Ridge,
it's the same milieu. It's the same. The federal nice farm animals are, this is the pattern that they're looking at on the right, and the kind of thing that they like to come in and manipulate.
Right.
Now, on the left, you have the most, at this point, this is after you had things like Black Panthers were shut down by the COINTELPRO, more or less.
Yeah, the left had gone silent by the late 70s, it seems.
Yes, exactly. This is my theory about what's going on here. Where I think that they were going was some kind of similar to their, because the system's attitudes, of course, of full spectrum dominance and strategies of tension, where you take especially if you can control people through the legal system, then by getting them into criminal action, etc. If you can do it on the left and the right, then it's very advantageous to people in power. So you would assume somewhere that there would be a leftist program. The irony was, and you see it in the manifesto itself, is this sort of disdain that the left has lost any kind of revolutionary fervor, and that its causes are actually system and corporate aligned, and that they do not have the willingness to violent action. This is a big theme in the work. And the big
Kaczynski, I think, notices that, but he doesn't sort of see the parallels with the right being kind of this other.
Well,
group.
he mentions the throw. He has some. Yes, the left is much more the subject of focus for his sort of revolutionary critique of the political solutions to what he sees as the problems with modern industrial society. They're dedicated to where he would have assumed the solution should come from, the political left. We can get into whether or not this is going to be a long show, guys.
Maybe you want to have Hans get to the cabin.
Let me just finish my point here, because I want Hank to comment on this as well. I think that the other side of this, where the feds were probably putting their provocateurs and ginning up the pretext for criminal political action, was in the radical environmentalist movement in places like Earth First, and later places like the Animal Liberation Front.
That's interesting. So you mean like green eco-terrorists, quote unquote, putting spikes in trees and
yeah,
chainsaws?
You saw that in Oregon. There was the spiking of trees. There were several bombing There were bombings associated with the Earth First Liberation Front. And in the context of the Kaczynski case, you have this idea that he was sort of, and he mentions mentions Earth Liberation Front in the manifesto, and that they had kind of fallen into almost like a reactionary and conservative attitude. Okay. It's like effectively it's it's him saying that, oh well, they're not on the correct revolutionary path. And he was involved with these people. He went near his home. There was a meeting of Earth, there was meetings of Earth First, and it was 1994. There was a Earth First meeting at University of Montana. It's 60 miles southwest of where he lived in Lincoln. And there was a name on the list that was signed T. Kaczynski, spelled Casinski. So it's a phonetic transliteration of. I mean, his name everyone knows is difficult to spell, and you heard it. There you go. So he does have some connection with these people, and so what I would posit is that there was some kind of FBI, however this shakes out in terms of the final facts of the case, whatever. But I would posit that there was some level of FBI involvement with leftist terror in the form of eco-terrorism, and that it is possible that people who knew Kaczynski and whom Kaczynski probably would endorse ideologically, at least at some point, might have taken material he had written, and those people might have been FBI connected. That's the extent of my spiel. I would just throw that in the back of your minds.
That's interesting. But what did he publish before the manifesto? That was the thing that
nothing. There was nothing. He did not publish anything.
Yes, you say if they took his material, where are they getting it prior to the?
Well, he had written it, and perhaps the speculation. Perhaps he had written it for internal distribution amongst a political group.
Okay,
right.
That's my 2 cents.
Cool.
Yeah, that's plausible. I mean, the thing that makes me skeptical of that is that the FBI at this time was going out of their way to entrap and generally dismantle all of these sorts of organizations to the extent that before September 11th, they actually had them as their greatest domestic terrorism threat, which is hilarious.
Precisely, though. That's my point.
Right, but I mean, from my perspective, the decision calculus would have been to play up any of those associations had they existed.
Yeah, we debated this a little before the show. What I would counter that with is the possibility that they were kind of scrapping that, and they were rolling all of this shit up, and they didn't want to drag that stuff out and drag out whatever informants or provocateurs they had, because we haven't heard anything, we haven't seen any of this since then, anyways. There hasn't been any high-profile eco-terrorism since then. The latest sort of trans.
You see like a lab animal release. They mostly seem like they've detoured, or that faction has detoured onto like PR campaigns publicizing like factory farm footage. But you don't see the sort of like direct violent action because that was so effectively shut down, and because the penalties are now so much more severe. But you see the same people running, or at least the same faction.
Well, and per his work itself, most of the foot soldiers that you would need for this have gotten themselves involved in anti-racist and homosexual or heterosexual action. It's the signal high payoff for the trees doesn't cut it with the poor darkies and the faggots.
And honestly, like in the manifesto, his critiques of the sorts of leftist organizations that comprise like the radical environmentalist movement makes me think that like he couldn't stand working with those sorts of people in the counterfactual.
That's a fair point.
That would be. I would factor that in as well and say that he had some involvement with these people and was like, yeah, these people are garbage. I'm getting burnt out from this, and maybe some kind of more radical element had contacted him. Yeah, we're serious about a struggle against technological society, bro.
What are you willing to do, man?
Yeah.
How far
just
are you
think the film Imperium, but with like hippies.
Hey kids, you want to blow up a federal building? Yeah, it's kind of like that approach.
Uncle Matt, you want to buy us firecrackers and pipes?
Well, he talks about logging camps a lot in one of his letters or something, and so I think there's something to Nick's hypothesis. It's not proof, but he obviously does care about the environment a lot.
Well, I don't have any proof, and we can segue in. I'm speculating as to what else could be going on here, because the problem that we're about to see, let's power through that so we can have a discussion about his philosophy or the philosophy.
Well, let Hans wrap up on the events of the arrest and trial.
Well, that's what I'm going to say, but what I preface this with is the trial itself. It was a railroading. We can all agree on that much. Correct?
Yeah.
Let him lay it out, and then we can talk about it. Hans, go ahead.
All right. So, Kaczynski gets taken in, and they find him in what they think is pretty terrible shape. He was dirty, hadn't shaved in a while, hair was unkempt, so on. So they shower him down, shave him up, put him in a holding facility.
This is what I think Kaczynski claims. One quote he heard from one of the agents was that, "I admire your lifestyle," when he arrested him. And I guess he had read the manifesto before that. But
yeah, so if you read a lot of reports of FBI arrests, they're pretty funny because like this is a tick of theirs, a tactic that like unless they're coming in to kick your ass, they're extremely conciliatory, very polite,
good cop.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, is there like, dude, it's a sweet cabin. Like, where do you keep your gunpowder or whatever?
I really like the shelf where you keep your potassium chloride, Mr. Kaczynski. It looks very nice.
Are you a woodworker? Do you have engraving techniques? Are you familiar with wood construction methods? Would you say?
Basically, what we're trying to get across to here, folks, is that the FBI aren't your friends. Don't let them make you think.
Well, but see, this gets into the psychology of Kaczynski. He interpreted that as the FBI agent was his friend, and so this is the mathematician's naivete of real people. Like they sort of can't really relate, and it's like, oh wow, the guy actually agreed with what I was saying, but he just couldn't do it because the system was keeping him locked in, and he had that mortgage payment or something. And that was the sort of point he was trying to make in one of his letters.
Yeah.
He didn't take it as cynically as you guys, and I would agree with probably what you're arguing, but he didn't see it that way.
So they immediately charge him with possessing bomb components and hold him without bail, because they don't have a lot to go on. They can't immediately prove that you killed these three people and that you sent these other bombs. All we know is that there's this privately done linguistic analysis they were going to try and replicate on our end. And when we showed up at your cabin, you had bomb-making materials on your shelf. So we're gonna throw you in lockup until we can get a trial going.
Let's be clear as to what bomb-making components are,
right.
Especially for people who live out in the middle of nowhere. Like, you're talking about batteries, wire, plumbing supplies, and any sort of thing that you might use. For instance, if you're doing hunting with a muzzleloader or reloading your own metallic cartridges, it's fairly innocuous material in sort of isolation, and actually very common material, especially in that area of the country.
The sort of clue is the explosive, and it's is it like ammonium nitrate or something, fertilizer basically, that was used in the Oklahoma City bombing case. So I don't know if
allegedly.
Yeah. But I didn't hear those two words in this.
Well,
case,
a further note, I mentioned PatCon. Oklahoma City is one of the main instruments of PatCon. People can look into. It's a subject for us for another show, but people can look into Jesse Trinidad. I'll put a link there for people curious.
So he gets indicted not long thereafter in Sacramento for the murders of Hughes Curtin and Murray, and then he also gets indicted for the attacks on Galertner and Epstein in New Jersey, or I'm sorry, in Connecticut, and then also in New Jersey for the Moser murder. Sacramento federal judge, grand jury returns a 10-count indictment against him, which is pretty damning. New Jersey gets him an indictment on the Thomas J. Moser death. 97. Jury selection starts. And then 98. Scheduled opening statements are delayed because previously, just about 2 weeks prior, the jury selection had been stopped abruptly because Judge Garland, Burrell, and Kaczynski and his defense lawyers all met because of an attorney-client issue. So this attorney-client issue was his defense lawyers asserting against Kaczynski's will that he was mentally ill.
These were federal appointed defense
lawyers. These are public defendants.
That's typical in federal cases. And
in addition, sorry, go ahead, Adam.
Well, I mean, in this case, it's actually not necessarily a big deal because I don't think Kaczynski had any funds to speak of, but it is a big deal for most people who do have some assets because what the federal government will do oftentimes, and I think they have an extremely high conviction rate, by the way. It's something like 200 out of 210 or something like that. It's insane. But what they'll do is if you are indicted, whatever the proper legal term is, basically if you're being processed by one of these federal courts, they will freeze your assets, or they can do that, and they often do that. And that effectively eliminates your ability to get an outside attorney, let alone a good one or one that's going to work with you. Yeah. And so all you're left with is one of these federal goons who basically does this all day and wants to keep good terms with these judges, and so he's not really going to lose his job over this, and so whatever, we'll go through the motions, let's just sign a deal, buddy. And that's the bullshit you're left with. So if you do not go into that system hoping you're going to get a fair trial, you basically it's up to whatever they want to do to you.
Well, in addition to that, his federally appointed attorney, Michael Donahoe, first of all, he refused to raise the issue of the evidence planting and tampering at the cabin. And he also requested that the federal judge block lawyers from offering their services to Kaczynski.
Farce.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The sort of rationale, there's like a half dozen things that we just sort of glossed over. Federal criminal prosecutions are designed to be sort of like this assembly line thing where you're provided your due process along the way to a speedy and forthright conviction.
Sounds like a kangaroo court to me.
Yeah, I mean, it does. There are sort of reasons why these sorts of constructs exist and can be employed non-maliciously. Your lawyer's job isn't necessarily to do what you tell them to do. Your lawyer's job is to provide you a competent defense. So if the claim is that you're not competent to advocate for your own interests, which is the claim, if you're contending that somebody is legally insane, then there's still a process by which that theoretically has to be adjudicated, which is basically you politely ask the judge, hey, does this guy look like a nut to you? It's oh yeah, sure. Okay, so I'm not going to follow his directions. Then I'm going to present the defense that I think that I can win. So, I mean, the underlying issue is that Ted Kaczynski is obviously not actually insane. That's the problem. That he is being deprived of his ability to actually participate in his own defense which is theoretically a right that's guaranteed to you.
Well, in addition to that, you have that the jury were exposed to the very sensational media trial that had preceded this by this point. It was unlikely that the jury was free from that. And in addition to that, you have the question of the evidence and the tampering of the evidence by the FBI, who excluded all other authorities from accessing and all other local authorities, etc.
So, do we want to go through sort of more of the trial mechanics, or can we sort of jump to the inevitable conclusion there?
Well, let's.
Well, we can give your summary of it.
Just give a summary of it and sort of this mental illness drama, because this is just where this is really just the crux of the trial for him. So his lawyers are trying to frame him for being mentally ill. Ted Kaczynski agrees or disagrees with that notion. And in fact, in one incident in the courtroom, when he realizes that his lawyers have been working behind his back with the judge and the prosecutors, he flips out and he screams at his defense attorney, "Is that what you've been telling them?" And then he yells, "I want to represent myself." And the courtroom just explodes with, everyone is just all losing their minds. And apparently the judge actually put his head in his hands and started shaking his head, because he realized what this meant. He realized that if Kaczynski was going to represent himself, it was, the biggest trial on the minds of the United States at that time. And you have this insane mass bomber who's going to represent himself and talk at length probably about his own case.
No, he's worried that he's actually going to probably appeal to the public, and the judge is going to have to oversee this whole thing.
The judge's interest is in having a orderly trial and everything going by the book, and having a competent administration of due process. They don't want a circus, a farce, something where they're going to have every decision of theirs brought up on appeal, something where they have to go and throw the defendant in jail for contempt while he's simultaneously being his own lawyer. That's a clusterfuck.
Right. Well, this was after OJ's trial, and that was, why did they agree to have cameras in there? I mean, I don't understand what that was about, but I don't think that's really happened since, albeit with court TV. I guess those are sort of minor cases, but with these high-profile cases, I can't imagine that judge ever wanting something like that to happen.
So he gets into this drama with his lawyers, tries to have them fired. The Bureau of Prisons, psychiatrist Dr. Sally Johnson is tasked by the judge with determining whether or not Mr. Kaczynski is competent enough to stand trial, whether or not he is mentally ill. So as you can imagine, some government goon psychiatrist tries to match wits with a PhD in mathematics that has a 167 IQ and a profound disdain for what he terms psychological suffering. He pretty much toys with her, messes with her for the entirety of these questioning rounds. She concludes that he is competent to stand trial, but that he is also a paranoid schizophrenic somehow at the same time, but that his paranoid schizophrenia is in remission, or it's not active. There's no proof offered that he really is paranoid schizophrenic. No reports of delusions, no excessively psychotic behavior except for bombings he's blamed for. No erraticism. They have a very hard time actually saying he's paranoid schizophrenic, but this puts Kaczynski in a tight bind, because he would have to then submit himself to open questioning in front of the court regarding his mental illness and his mental state, and the history of his mental state, which is an area he was shy about. So he goes through this dance back and forth judge regarding self-representation. Judge eventually just puts his foot down and says, no, never going to self-represent yourself unless you're willing to undergo, public court questioning regarding your mental illness. Kaczynski then agrees to a plea bargain, effectively, which puts him at life in prison without parole, sentences him to pay about $15 million to victims, which is sort of a joke because he was living off of less than $1,000 a year after he abandoned Berkeley and in his cabin. The case pretty much ends in mid 1998, and he is dispatched to a supermax security prison in Colorado, where he remains to this day. He spent some time there speaking actually with Timothy McVeigh, as well as the World Trade Center bomber, and ever since then has submitted some letters, corresponded with reporters, corresponded with people interested in his work, has had some books published, but that was sort of the end of Ted Kaczynski's life.
Now he's gotten some of his writing published since his imprisonment, and it is under the terms, as he states, that it can't advocate for any illegality, and the people that do agree to publish them even will censor some of what he writes, probably for just reputational concerns for themselves, at least. But there was this recent thing where the journalists, he was sort of like being coy with them, but he said, after a 20-year silence, which is not true. He's been talking to certain people. I don't think he's granted, sort of like mass media interviews. He said, after 20-year silence, if you want to write to me and sort of submit your application of yourself to me for agreeing to an interview, go right ahead. And I haven't heard anything from that since. This was maybe a year plus ago. But I was just wondering generally, like how he got his words out. There's this one author or psychologist that published his book Technological Slavery, I think. That's kind of interesting, that process.
Well, the book is a collection of his writings.
Sure. But Kaczynski is on personal terms with this guy. So I don't know if you can go see him in jail, like, in person, or how that even works. But Kaczynski claims in one of these writings that the prison system will inspect everything he writes. And so I'm wondering how much we're actually able to see from what he does write.
Right. Well, we're going to go into his writings, and we're going to take a break first and return with a discussion of industrial society and its future. Nothing fell from thy hands, but one book no more, O vine in sunniest lands that such a fruitage bore. I took from the leaves, and I around me the present woe. Wildly for saviors men cry, thee they no longer know. They knew thee near the benighted, they could but rail and condemn. Or hast thou requited, for hast thou fathomed them? Not scorn but appreciation, to him the world was a play. At his smiling contemplation, its last veil fell away. Mankind ever loves the deceiver, for the liar their laurels twine. But thou hast deceived them never, thou ever were simply thine. O genius to whom his age never in homage bowed, no not nor counted stage, when he by the empty crowd, who never self-conquest chasing, no conquest over others gained, who never his brother embracing, the cup of deception drained, who heaven high excelling the world of spite and pelf, along his foemen quelling, planted himself on himself. O genius, wert thou sunken into the silence of the night? No, my lips have drunken I am awakened to the light. Immortal, with awe I greet thy name from the night around. I seek the trace of thy feet, no longer can it be found. What goal did presumption set thee? Thine own God thou wouldst be. I love thee, let men forget thee. What are their ravings to me? I see thrusting aside, and below the screaming throng, then soaring afar and wide, our eagle pinions strong. Whither? Thou knowst no ponder. None has followed thy way. Silent sleeps the world wanderer, night behind him, before him day. Past the gods whose distance blots, on to the utmost sublime. Yea, thou art gone, but thy thoughts watch over the slumbering time. We are here now to discuss the actual work of Uncle Ted. Now, what did you guys think upon reading this?
It's extremely cogent. There's obvious points of, or maybe not obvious, but I find significant sort of points of disagreement with some of the implications that he draws. But as a self-contained argument, it's extremely lucid and compactly written. It wouldn't be out of place as sort of an academic book for a certain crowd.
Yeah, well, I would. My reaction reading it was, I had a lot of kind of oh shit moments reading it. I thought it was at one hand very interesting and even prophetic, as somebody said earlier. I mean, you got to consider when he's writing about it and his references to things like transsexuals and his critique of the left. Some of the more political aspects of it are very impressive, really. But the overall philosophical gist I got from it, we had for the intermission a poem that was written by a German individualist anarchist to Max Stirner. I thought it was appropriate personally, and that was the one thing that I kept thinking about reading it was that individualist egoist sort of school. And we could talk about that if Hans, Adam, what did you all think of it?
Oh, you guys are the poets in this group. I'm just
what was your impression on reading it? What kind of, have you seen this kind of thinking before elsewhere? What did you guys take from it?
I've seen tons of this. So the philosophical sort of strain, the sort of description of leftist dynamics is sort of independently interesting, but he basically constructs this idea of global industrial capitalism as a form of social control, not even a form of social control, but this sort of apex of social control. That's what the thing is for, to sort of fit individuals into productive uses for the system itself. That this causes the alienation of oneself from one's own labor, that one finds oneself doing elaborate symbolic manipulations to move abstractions around rather than doing something that sort of directly contributes to one's immediate concrete well-being. But these criticisms are I think accurate. I think even a lot of supporters of capitalism, me amongst them, would say that is true but not relevant, and they're also not at all novel criticisms.
Right.
Hardly.
A lot of what he,
Wait, you mean trading collateralized mortgage obligations on the internet is not the wave of the human race going forward?
I mean, I don't really have a problem with that, to be honest.
I do, actually.
There's
I think it's
So,
it's sort of a pathetic use of humanity.
well, I would agree with that. I mean, there are a lot of things that are sort of not optimal for the soul, but that nonetheless exist as part of a system.
See, it's interesting. Nick opened with poetry because I actually do appreciate good art, and I would have more patience for something like that in my own life if I felt like I had the luxury of it. But I don't feel relaxed enough to indulge in something like that, and I'll call it an indulgence for myself at least, just because I don't have any direct value from it in our current system. Now, in a other system, when you did have leisure time to truly not worry about the mortgage payment or the bank, taking your house or your employer firing you, you would feel more comfortable actually living your life. And it's just like the system we have is so fast paced, cutthroat.
That's
a very important point, Adam.
Yeah,
because this is a key aspect of. Keep in mind, Ted is not a reactionary of the conservative variety. This is a radical reactionary who could look even to the time of the aristocrats. For instance, he refers to he calls this, the terminology he uses, is surrogate activity. And in one instance, he gives the example of none other than Emperor Hirohito of Japan. And the
marine biologist.
Exactly. Emperor Hirohito, marine biologist. And he sees this in terms of whatever pursuit it may be, scientific or artistic. Anything beyond that fundamental level of subsistence needs is essentially a way of satisfying a psychological process that exists, that always exists and is allowed upon it. It's a very hardcore rendering of what the Marxists would call bourgeois society, and the term is of course used in his book. He has an interesting definition of bourgeois, if I can find it in my notes here.
Well, it also sort of describes like this idea of the alienation of labor, which is like a sort of an idea that kind of clearly derives from I can never pronounce his goddamn name, Hegel, let's just say. But okay, so let me just lay out the fundamental issue that I have with Ted.
Do you want me to say what he had to say about that first or after?
Oh, go for it.
Okay, so his surrogate so he calls it surrogate activity, and he says a surrogate activity is an activity that is directed toward an artificial goal that the individual pursues for the sake of fulfillment that he gets from pursuing the goal, not because he needs to attain the goal itself. For instance, there is no practical motive for building enormous muscles, hitting a little white ball into a hole, or acquiring a complete series of postage stamps. Yet many people in our society devote themselves with passion to bodybuilding, golf, or stamp collecting. Some people are more other-directed than others, and therefore will more readily attach importance to a surrogate activity simply because the people around them treat it as important or because society tells them it's important. That is why some people get very serious about essentially trivial activities such as sports, bridge, or chess, or arcane scholarly pursuits. Whereas others who are more clear-sighted never see these things as anything but surrogate activities that they are, and consequently never attach any importance other than satisfy their need for the power process in that way. And
So
that's what he calls it, is this psychological, the power process.
Right, which is like this part specifically is like straight up Marx. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but like this has like a clear philosophical antecedent, and he actually makes Marx's case, for what it's worth, much better than Marx does.
And he also claims in very clear terms he does not like Marxists.
Right. Which is, who does? So here's my thinking on this. Like, humans are not solitary beasts. Like, at a minimum, like, you have, like, sort of a male-female delineation that fundamentally represents, like, a division of labor. Like, you see this in every society, in every circumstance. Like, there's no such thing as like conceptions of humans as sort of atomized amoebas, like totally self-sufficient. And as soon as you get a couple of humans together, you also have a power relation. Like, again, this isn't a bad thing, and this doesn't necessarily sort of like explain the totality of human existence, like some of the postmodernists would say. But like, it's a thing that's going to happen. So when you have people with goals that have like different expertises and desires and capabilities, and you also have them forming social arrangements that allow like one person to direct the work of others to some extent. Like, you now have like all of the fucking pieces in place that get you from like Kalahari Bushmen to like walking on the face of the moon. Like, that process is baked in. As far as it goes, like, you might eventually hit like a pure limit of you're not capable industrially or intellectually or whatever of advancing further. But that process has repeated over and over and over again. And to critique that as like capitalism is like a form of domination, of alienation of the individual from his labor, like, it's like, yeah, but so what? Like, it's simply not going to happen that you're going to cause a collapse in any meaningful case of that like metaphysical power structure. The most that you can do is like, you know, kill an ideally small number of people in his case.
I kind of agree with your general sort of skepticism that his ideal version of humanity is not really seen anywhere, with one or two maybe exceptions in my opinion. I personally observe a lot of kind of ideal human harmony exhibited in the Amish, and I don't know if he ever explicitly cited them, but I don't know of any other group aside from maybe the Mennonites, at least in America, that has ever come close to something that is anti-technological and not vulnerable.
Yeah, so
this is
not anti-technological is the thing. The thing is that they have incredibly advanced social technology that allows them to determine how they're going to employ the inventions that they themselves prospectively come up with.
Hank just kind of blew past, like, we should draw this out for the listeners, because Hank hit on something very quickly that needs to be we have to look at for a second. So he said one of the questions that you're going to have if you read this is this work anti-technology or is it anti-society, and wherein is the difference? And Hank describes the Amish as technological insofar as they have social technologies. And that's the correct way to look at it from the perspective of the author of this work here, is that it's not, he doesn't actually spend a lot of time. You would expect, and I expected, to see a kind of a diatribe against pollution and animals.
He gives examples in some of his later work.
He gives examples on his side, but he refers people elsewhere to the work of Liberation Front. But the core philosophical idea is what he's getting at is actually an antisocial theory. Technology it merely exacerbates social problems on the basis of individual psychic suffering through, yes, a Marxist alienation process, because their satisfaction is only genuine when it is the work of their actual needs and not like a something that is created having their needs fulfilled, a sort of a psychological need, which again,
like, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but like many people would argue the primal human desire is like the desire to reproduce, which literally requires at least one other person, cooperating to some extent.
And then a division of labor between those two.
So
which is,
that,
Hans. Oh, no, go ahead.
Well, to all these points in paragraph 64 writes, a theme that appears repeatedly in the writings of the social critics of the second half of the 20th century is the sense of purposelessness that afflicts many people in modern society. This purposelessness is often called by other names such as anomic or middle-class sanity. We suggest that the so-called identity crisis is actually a search for a sense of purpose, often for commitment to a suitable surrogate activity.
Yes.
It may be that existentialism is in large part a response to the purposelessness of modern life. Very widespread in modern society is the search for fulfillment. But we think that for the majority of people in activity whose main goal is fulfillment, does not bring completely different satisfactory fulfillment.
This is the central normative basis of his critique is this concept of autonomy and freedom. And we should look at what exactly he means by that. And it's
really quickly, I mean, he kind of takes this school of thought, this very Heideggerian, very Eulerian school of thought, that there's two types of technology, right? There's small scale technology, and then there's wider systematic organizational technology. What Kaczynski is fundamentally opposed to, and what he thinks limits autonomy, is the latter, is organizational, systematic technology that begets more technology, that creates a system that changes people instead of people using the technology to change the environment but stay the same.
Yes.
Right. And I don't think that those two are necessarily separable. You would never look a priori at something like, oh, I have a really cool way of getting the water out of all these lead mines that we have, and that this is going to kind of refactor all of society via an industrial revolution. The fact that you can't say how these things are going to necessarily play out with when you impose them on human society, I think that he would probably contend one of the problematic aspects of the sort of micro scale technology, that it rapidly becomes used as a social tool because men are social animals. Any tool is going to be employed socially.
It's unquestionably an egoist critique because he does not admit the possibility, his explanations for what drives scientific progress are effective over other men, or the satisfaction of a sort of what are this French we do it.
No, that's not repeatable.
Yeah, this sort of boredom and this stasis of a bourgeois existence, wherein your needs are so easily met.
I think we should try to explain his basic arguments before we tear them apart. I don't think we've done that yet, so let me just put forward.
Well, I'm explaining his main central normative purpose here is the preservation of an autonomy.
Yeah,
and
I would
what
agree.
I found to be interesting about this was that he does not give any kind of idealistic or metaphysical explanation for this. His explanation for it is entirely psychological. And what I came back to inevitably was the Plato's cave. He does not adequately explain a reason why it is that if social technology, if social control and behavioral control was painlessly perfected a la Brave New World, why he would be opposed to it. Because
he gives a few reasons, but go ahead.
No, what are they? Go ahead, Hank.
The sort of freedom that he's prioritizing, and I love the fact that he numbers his paragraphs.
Yeah, it is quite easy.
It's extremely comfy in Uncle Ted's cabin. So he says in paragraph 94, by freedom, we mean the opportunity to go through the power process with real goals, not the artificial goals of surrogate activities, and without interference, manipulation, or supervision from anyone, especially from any large organization. Freedom means being in control, either as an individual or as a member of a small, he emphasizes small, group, of the life and death issues of one's existence, food, clothing, shelter, and against whatever threats there may be in one's environment. Freedom means having power, not the power to control other people, but power to control the circumstances of one's own life.
And he goes on to say one does not have freedom if anyone else, especially a large organization, has power over one, no matter how benevolently, tolerantly, and permissively that power may be exercised.
Which
is important.
Is a very, like, ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. That's almost a totalitarian vision of freedom, if there can be.
Exactly. That's why I come back to the radical egoism.
What do you mean by that?
That's an apt description.
Well, egoism is you filter your understanding, your scales of value are consciously that of you, I.
Yeah, sure. Sure, I can see that.
And so freedom is about individual autonomy. He doesn't have, for instance, what a certain type of socialist may say, freedom for the people. So he rejects this, and we can get into his critiques of leftism. Okay. But ultimately, his normative position, the reason I bring up things like Plato's cave, is because what is the threat that he's describing? The threat is a threat to autonomy, and what he goes on to describe as sort of the social malaise and decay is the result of psychological stress put on people,
right?
As a result of, really, again, back to the fundamental Marxist alienation. It's a fundamental stress by their having to sort of synthetically create avenues to fulfill their natural needs.
Now, I think that's a fairly well explained reason. I mean, if you want to go into kind of like, well, why? If you can keep asking why, I mean, you'll never get.
Well, I would full-heartedly endorse much of his positive critique about the stress of the system and society. I guess we did kind of blow past that.
Like his so there's a few different aspects. Like there's his description of certain dynamics, and then like he very clearly lays out how that description of the dynamics interplays with his subjective value judgments. And he's actually pretty good at splitting up the two and not conflating them. And I think his description of the sort of technological process of human civilization and its employment as a form of domination and control is like basically 100% accurate.
Yeah, I would agree too.
And like, I'm just on the side of Skynet, I guess.
I mean,
okay. So obviously I wouldn't go that far. Like, so the problem is that, and the reason why I describe it as totalitarian, that he's
an anarchist. I don't understand this term applied to him.
Because if you take a radical idea and you take it to its logical conclusion, it doesn't matter to whom you think it applies. It's an absolutist idea that
he's extreme, and he's like willing to force.
That's what I mean, to
people.
Each and every individual.
Right.
It's an idea that like.
Okay, let me give you. Hank, hold on one moment. So the revolution must be international and worldwide. It cannot be carried out on a nation-by-nation basis. Whenever it is suggested that the United States, for example, should cut back on technological progress or economic growth, people get hysterical and start screaming that if we fall behind the technology of the Japanese, we'll get ahead of us. Holy robots! The world will fly off its orbit if the Japanese ever sell more cars than we. Nationalism is the greatest promoter of technology. More reasonably, it is argued that if the relatively democratic nations of the world fall behind technology while nasty dictatorial nations like China, Vietnam, and North Korea continue to progress, eventually the dictators may come to dominate the world. That is why the industrial system must be attacked in all nations simultaneously to the extent this may be possible.
right? Which is basically like Lenin.
Trotsky.
Yeah, Lenin, Trotsky. Yeah. Like, so I mean, his point is that the dynamic of like industrial civilization accruing resources for self-propagation means that you are, like, prospectively at least unfree in the long run if you allow any germ of this idea to continue in existence, which is totalitarian. Like, because it leaves no space for instance, some group of people to decide that, like, you know, it would be really cool if I could, like, make marble statues in an area where there don't happen to be any marble quarries. So now I need to ship my marble, which means I need to, like, send some trade goods back. And, like, holy shit, now I have civilization.
The philosophy, like any religion, frankly, is sort of all-encompassing, but the sort of locus of control is not centralized, which is what I would associate with a totalitarian system. It's basically this hyper-dynamic, distributed system that has these actors who are basically stepping in to blow up any centralization. I don't see that. I mean, we have to separate somehow. We have to distinguish between the Soviet Union, which was Moscow, and everything else is underneath that, versus what he's advocating for, which is basically, I want to blow up anything that even resembles a central locus of control.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you see this, like, weird strain of totalitarian anarchism that, like, was a historical thing, or like sort of like the Emma Goldman.
I would say he's an extremist. Like, he's an extreme. He, like, takes his ideas.
No, yeah, you see it in Emma Goldman. You see it. He fits in with the. That's the thing about that hardcore egoism. I mean, you can see it even on the capitalist side of it. Like Ayn Rand herself was not a anarchist, but they're anarchist Randian disciples, and it's that same this must apply. It's that everywhere and everyone. It must apply, and it's not so much that Ted, like, the majority of this work is a negative critique. Mm-hmm. The positive aspect is, I mean, it does pay that lip service to the organic formation of this or that, but the problem I see that Ted has here is that he sees any kind of socialization. I mean, he has a very good critique of what he calls over socialization, and that's one of the two main critiques he has of the left. And the reason he's pointing his guns at the left is because he sees the left as the ones who should rightfully hold the mantle of opposition to the industrial capitalist system. And his critique of their failure as a revolutionary ideology is, I loved it. It was very, because I have the exact same view of these people. And it's why they disgust me so much, is because they're really, you know, they wear the cloak of the rebels. And I mean, this is hash. Everyone who understands these people really knows this. They're posturing about rebellion and revolution is exactly that. It's posturing. It's a hyper socialized behavior that they're looking for approval from others. They're not actually interested in overthrowing the pig system.
Right. Yeah,
and
the approval seeking is actually a very good observation, because that explains a lot of this behavior, because they get a lot of positive press. Well, it's a twofold Facebook likes or whatever it is from this behavior.
Yes, and it's that Kaczynski's explanation is twofold. He points to two things in particular: the concept of inferiority and over socialization. And when you merge the two together, you get exactly that, because what you have is a situation where people's everyday psychological processes and values, etc., behaviors, habits, are shaped entirely by their social milieu and their relationship to that. And then when you throw on there a very deep and pervasive inferiority complex, then those needs that are then satisfied by that group, by that participation in this hyper-socialized process, the needs, the well is that much deeper.
What makes him interesting, in one way at least, to me, is that Kaczynski you would expect a guy like this, who's sort of top of his ranking in almost every intellectual field, well, at least mathematically. We could argue about his sort of a social understanding, but you would expect a guy like this to become a technologist. You would expect him to want to dominate others using technology, and he actually has the opposite.
Well, he
path.
doesn't. He doesn't. And
Like,
some of the reactionaries.
the modal
I'm
mathematician I know.
we have some. I'm sure we have some very hardcore religious traditionalist listeners who, to them, they'll be willing to identify that his strain of reactionary politics, his strain of rejection of the system, is ironically rooted in a scientific and materialistic worldview. He was trained as a scientist, and his complaints and his critiques are fundamentally based in things like psychological stress. And that's why I come back to something like the cave, because he has, and this is true of all people of this sort, and this is true of leftist revolutionaries of every sort. You cannot oppose power and control and things like this if your fundamental reason for doing so is psychological distress, is discomfort and unhappiness. Because this is something he gets into very extensively, and this is what makes it very interesting. Is he talks about he has an understanding of exactly, like, his finger is on the pulse here. It's about the system is trying to control behavior because the system is putting people in situations that are unnatural to them, and they have a psychological response to it. They experience unpleasantry that needs to be coped with somehow. It needs to be coped with either drugs or entertainment, and these are things he discusses in the manifesto. And the whole problem that he's facing, the whole issue with technological society and the social organization needed to support it, is an issue of the individual being psychologically compromised by being put into a situation where their purpose and their interactions, their drives, are subordinated to that of a higher mechanism. And as technology increases, the mechanism becomes ever more complicated, et cetera. And this is the process that he's critiquing. And the perspective by which he's critiquing it, the value system by which he's critiquing it, is one in which this puts people into a situation of stress and anxiety. And he notes that the systems of technological control are becoming more advanced, but he never truly is able to come up with an explanation for why this is a bad thing if those systems could be perfect.
Wait, can I try to explain my understanding of his reasoning? He cites these primitive tribes like the Indians and the people who live in Amazon, and he says they're basically they work less and they're happier. Now, I don't know how else you can sort of look at this from an economic standpoint, at least, and say that that's not sort of a value. It's like the objective function of his equation, and say that's not a rational way to compare them to the others and say their system is better for that particular objective. It just seems like that's his objective. He wants people to be not stressed, happy. And
yes, that's an individualistic and material scientific based worldview.
Okay, but it's also like pretty universal. I mean, people don't want to be unhappy, right? So
no, it's not. This entire conception of all these things are results of the Western society. Again, I'm throwing a bone to our like hardcore reactionary listeners, assuming we still have them. Like, my point is that his entire critique is still based in a modernist, individualistic, and scientific
What would
worldview.
you say he should have? I mean, just try to
I'm not saying well, okay, one thing I'll say is that he doesn't have a meaningful conception of what human community should look like.
Well, that's because
it's because he has an antisocial.
Yeah, exactly.
It's an antisocial philosophy to the core.
And it's an antisocial person. I mean, he just doesn't have
an international revolutionary. I mean, it's fundamentally it's Bolshevik on a certain level, guys. Right. I hate to break.
Well, no, the universalist. But why do you keep saying it's Bolshevik? I mean, there are many ideologies.
It's a world
that are
revolutionary scientific. Okay.
No, it's
egalitarian.
Not. Okay.
Yes. He's smarter than these faggots.
There are some things that it shares in common with
Bolshevism,
but it is not exclusively.
Bolshevik.
Thank you, but yeah, I mean, I think it's universalist in the sense that it's worldwide reaching in scope, and it's very fundamental. But Bolshevism is a technocratic elite running things. It's very centralized.
No, I mean, I don't.
Technocratic.
It's Bolshevism. Okay, yes, you could say I jumped the gun on that, but the ultimate conclusion of Marxism is sort of a utopian, egalitarian,
like
anarchic.
that. I think Ted's problem is that he doesn't actually lay out a roadmap to how to get there. I mean, he's like, well, this is obviously what we should all do, but okay. Like, I'll give you an example. I was going through the math of this, and this is all sort of, I'll give you my sort of assumptions, but it's like, all right, he was sort of a subsistence farmer, but not really, because he was actually apparently buying flour at the store, and so he was hunting and supplementing with his garden. But in order to live off of 1.4 acres, you basically have to be like a perfect farmer. That's like the smallest you could get, especially in that climate. You couldn't do it. So he had to hunt. So he had to have that area accessible to him, and he had to buy also from the system's food production apparatus. So if he applied this approach to the entire population of the United States, there wouldn't be enough land. I did the math, and I'll work you through the assumptions, but basically, if you cut off Alaska, which is basically you can't farm up there, it's just too cold. There's not enough sunlight for half the year too. So you've got basically the lower 48. All right, if you're working with that, you've got about 400 million acres of arable land. There's 2 billion roughly total, and then you've got 40 acres per person. That was the old 40 acres and a mule thing. If you do that, you've only got about 10 million people max in the United States. Now, if you cut it down to 2 acres a person, you can get about 200 million people, give or take. But it's like everybody's doing it perfectly. And then how do you get to that? How do you actually teach people how to farm from our system? He doesn't even talk about it. I mean, I just was dumbfounded that this guy who's a mathematician can't even do this basic stuff. That's my critique of him.
Yeah, well,
and this is what I mean by you talk about having a critique of power systems and the domination of humans. What if I tell you nobody, you're going to be a subsistence farmer, and actually you're going to be dead with 95% probability before that happens? That's a system of domination. And,
well, he addresses this. His comment on it. Hans has something to say. Let me dig up his. He basically says the fundamental difference between that and the frontier is that was something that. Okay, here we go. Found it. It's 57. The difference, we argue, is that modern man has the sense, largely justified, that changes. Here's that, his all caps, imposed on him. Whereas the 19th century frontiersman had the sense, also largely justified, that he created change himself by his own choice. That's his rationalization of that problem.
Hans, did you have
Yeah, sorry. So I don't know how modern it is. I think some of it is very a couple sections with some commentary in between. So one thing he makes very clear early on is the conservatives are fools. They whine about the decay of traditional values, yet they enthusiastically support technological progress and economic growth. Apparently, it never occurs to them that you can't make rapid, drastic changes in technology and the economy of a society without causing rapid changes in all other aspects of the society as well, and that such rapid changes inevitably break down traditional values. And then shortly thereafter, he says, the breakdown of traditional values to some extent implies the breakdown of the bonds that hold together traditional small-scale social groups. So what he's essentially talking about is the Industrial Revolution took the medieval and feudal societies and broke them down. And you'll see this often a lot with reactionary thought, especially now, is that the feudalist societies were freer, people worked less, people had more leisure time, and they also, despite being these horribly oppressed feudal serfs, who had these evil, mean king overlords, created the entirety of the folk culture of continental Europe and England. And then later on, much later, he says, instead of arguing powerlessness and passivity, one should argue that the power of the industrial system should be broken, and this will greatly increase the power and freedom of individuals and small groups. So he is somewhat of an individualist, but he also keeps mentioning small social groups or just groups or small tribes. He's opposed to like widespread industrial collectivism, which is very materialist. But he's also opposed to this idea of pure scientism or pure materialism, because he makes several attacks on the modernist philosophy of science, and that modern science in general, just sort of marches on endlessly unless properly controlled or tempered.
It's because of its view of where it's going, though. It's a consequential critique. It's not
right.
It's not based in the actual worldview, the scientific worldview. It is a critique from the scientific worldview,
right,
that these processes lead to social disorder, and consequently unhappiness. That's the root of his critique, is psychological misery. He offers nothing beyond psychological misery. He does not offer an idealistic, transcendental. I mean, not saying you'll have to have that either. I mean, but this is just the fact. He doesn't provide that, and so it is ironically still a modernist critique, because you could look in the Christian Catholic traditions of the preaching of the various little schools preaching of chastity and poverty and things like that on a spiritual basis. His arguments are not spiritual. That's what this is what took me. I kind of expected that from someone who was rejecting technological society as a whole.
Why do you not consider his arguments spiritual? I mean, he's sort of anti-material.
The guy has no spirituality to him. I mean, I'm not judging his soul or anything. I'm not saying that. I'm just looking at what he wrote or what he allegedly wrote. He's a different type of person. He's not this sort of verbal type of guy that would, find himself on a late night talk show charming the crowd, but he is a thinker, and I think he's sort of assessed the material aspects of at least the current society to be lacking in value. And I would say he would prefer something that is more natural, and I would argue that that's somewhat spiritual. But he's not as sort of poetic, perhaps, as what you'd like from an artist. But I don't discount his spirituality, and that at least that's sort of the kind of opposite or outside factor from materialism. What are you expecting in a person you consider spiritual? Let me ask you that.
Metaphysics.
Metaphysics. Yeah, but exactly.
Give me something. Maybe I'm materialistic then, but I don't know what that means. That seems
you are
to me. Okay, fine. But what? Fine. But what are you talking about? I mean, you can't.
I'm talking about.
You're not metaphysical, bro. I'm like, well,
there's no.
Why?
Dude, look, my point is that even before the Industrial Revolution, you had similar critiques of social technology and material technology, and they emanate from some kind of view about how the universe is ordained to be, how God wants it to be, or what have you.
I just view it as a consequence of overcrowding. I mean, it's like you just run.
I'm saying if you look at the world in a this comes back to my earlier critique again and again about, say, Plato's cave. If you approach it as just a problem of social technology, if you say that, well, this makes people miserable, and he addresses this problem not to my satisfaction in his work, where he says he points this out. Well, people will say we just need more science, we just need more technology, but he never offers a reason why that won't work from his perspective. Because if the problem again is social misery or psychological unhappiness, what about drugs and robots? What about drugs and robots won't solve this problem? Why can't okay, so you don't need the material input of physical labor.
No, I
so
think
now you're miserable. Here's drugs and here's feelies.
I think
you can watch the feelies and take your soma.
I think freedom is a fundamental value of his, that he sees the drugs and robots taking away from him.
This is maybe a good point to bring in the kind of like core NRX interface, certainly with this guy. Like, so if you have the contention that human societies and social technologies are about the employment of domination, like the existence of a robot doesn't allow you to like have the same feeling that you get when you are like establishing order over like somebody else. So I mean, like, you could make a pretty well-founded, I think, empirical claim that the existence of something like the Moldbug exit option, where like, you know, VR porn 24/7, like the existence of that technology in the abstract, like in practice, it just gets used as a tool of domination, because that's how humans are. They use technologies in order to try to dominate other people. So, I mean, like, that's like a reasonable, like, explanation of why, like, and I think I'm trying to find this section right now. I think he even says as much about you know, why technological progress is like a self-solving problem. You have sort of a priori assumption that systems of domination are a bad idea. But I mean, like, well, go on.
Okay, so when you talk about domination, this kind of gets to what I was going to sort of use as my explanation for his thinking. Domination implies that one is over another at minimum, right? There has to be at least two. And so his sort of way of living, in his personal preference, obviously, is no one is over him. He doesn't want people to control him, give him orders. He talks about, you know, how people have to, you know, get a job, and it's like listen to these people that tell them what to do, and he doesn't like that. So he takes let's take the drug and robot example that Nick brought up. He doesn't like this, not because it doesn't deliver convenience or what most people would consider happiness. He takes it from a different point of view, which I personally can relate to because I operate this way. And I've noticed most people don't. So maybe this is part of the conflict that Nick and I are having with understanding this. But to me, it makes perfect sense that having a machine do my work for me is not something that I want, because I personally get a lot of satisfaction out of achieving things myself. And he says...
it depends on what your work is.
All right, but let me just finish up here. I'm not sure what you mean. But so he basically says the sense of security is not objective security. He makes the analogy of like somebody in the forest, you know, having to hunt for their own food, but having wild animals around him.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. And it's like, okay, that is objectively less, quote unquote, physically secure than living in a suburb with a wall around you and going to the grocery store to get your own food. But
it's always on you and the fortunes of nature, right?
Well,
that's his point.
It's you, and versus the suburb where you are getting the system's sustenance, you are not taking care of yourself. And this is what he wants. He wants people to take care of themselves, because that's how I personally prefer it, and that's, I think, how he prefers it. That's sort of why I see, you know, he viewing the system as basically just this miserable contraption. But what he fails to realize is that I think most people like it that way. They like this shit. I mean, this is like, I've had conversations with people who are like, well, I wish robots would just, you know, like take care of my laundry for me. And I'm like,
well, he knows that. That's why he wants to deprive them of that, because the route to their pure happiness is through the fruits of their own responsibility.
I mean, my nightmare is like that image of the guy. There's like a meme of like this fat dude, like, well, Idiocracy basically just did the same thing, but it's like, this fat dude sitting in a recliner watching the Idiot Tube. And he's pushing buttons to order his next order of pizza, and he's just not moving. He doesn't do anything. He's a complete uselessness, and it's just this abomination that consumer culture encourages.
Right. Well, there's a very bizarre relationship between his sort of elitism and his egalitarianism, so to speak. He recognizes, again, in the hypocrisy of the left. I mean, I feel like we should at least read one of his critiques just to give you an indication of how ahead of his time he is. You'll see the buzzwords. So this is from the very beginning, piece from the very beginning. In fact, the left today serves as a kind of fire extinguisher that douses and quenches any nascent revolutionary movement. What do I mean by the left? If you think that racism, sexism, gay rights, animal rights, indigenous people's rights, and social justice in general are among the most important issues the world currently faces, then you are a leftist, as I use the term. You can see he has these people's number because he understands that these things are devices by which the system controls people. I mean, maybe people listening think I'm being overly. I think Ted had a very brilliant analysis about the system's social control mechanisms. He understood really ahead of his time from someone who's not even coming from a so to speak, right-wing position. He understood the ways in which the controlled left is used to advance the agenda of the corporatist system. He deserves a lot of credit for all this. Like, I encourage people to read it. Like, when you're reading the work literally, it will be like, in my opinion, the first, 30-40% is the best of it. Well, and then you get into kind of goofball territory, in my opinion. But
he has paragraph 216.
Oh, that's at the end. Okay.
Yeah. This is just to add on to your point about the ridiculousness of left that he points out. But he says some leftists may seem to oppose technology, but they will oppose it only so long as their fighters' technological system is controlled by non-leftists. If leftism ever becomes dominant in society, so that the technological system becomes a tool in the hands of leftists, they will enthusiastically use it and promote its growth. In doing this, they will be repeating a pattern that leftism has shown again and again in the past. When the Bolsheviks in Russia were outsiders, they vigorously opposed censorship and the secret police. They advocated self-determination for ethnic minorities and so forth. But as soon as they came into power themselves, they imposed a tighter censorship and created a more ruthless secret police that had existed under the czars. And they oppressed ethnic minorities as much as the czars had done.
And you can apply that exact same critique to capitalism. The left they want their socialist order where they can run it, but they will reject any kind of anti-capitalist socialism that isn't to their liking. They don't want the racial socialists. They don't want the white socialists, so to speak.
I think the left has sort of
the same thing plays out,
mutated into something that was not really the left 40 years ago. I don't really know how to describe it.
Well, but
it's basically this phony, leftist thing that just is basically a corporatist oligarchic collaboration.
That's at the heart of of his critique, though. It's that you say you oppose the anti-nature, or when I say nature, I don't mean it in the way maybe right winger might. Literal like parks and shit, bro. Like you're for nature, so you're against logging and shit. Your animal rights, and you're against these aspects of the system. You say you're against capitalism, corporatism, and stuff. But if they don't fit into your program that is defined, as he would put it, by your over-socialization and pervasive inferiority complex, then you'll oppose it, and as such, you're counter-revolutionary. And in that respect,
the American left will oppose corporatism right up until there's like an affirmative action endeavor at the local tech store or at Facebook.
Or like Walmart has like tranny bathrooms or something.
Yeah, these people will crown Zuckerberg like the head of their Politburo.
Right.
It means more, opportunities for over-socialization, opportunities for them to take out their, the consequences of their inferiority on other people.
Right. That's exactly how
it's a fundamental hypocrisy, and we see it every day. So you have people, for example, we have people who literally put in their Twitter bio, under their real name, proud communist, and then they list their employment as Google.
Right.
Just complete insanity. Like they know they're in power. They'll speak endlessly and quote Angela Davis bullshit about how they're out of power and the evil prison system and this and that. They know they're in power, and they know they're being duplicitous, and they know.
I don't know how duplicitous it is, because communism is a technocratic elite.
Yeah, but they know that they're just waiting for the time to
Yeah, but it's not idealistic.
I don't know,
It's
do
communism
what?
hand in glove with capitalism. Is the point.
I mean,
whatever. They're a
they
bunch of
just
fat
want-
nerds who are not actually going to do
neoliberalism.
anything. But
Like, there's a term for this.
What's that, Hank?
Neoliberalism is
Oh, yeah.
Right.
the term for like that exact phenomenon.
Yeah. I mean, these people are just waiting for the opportunity to dox you and ruin your life because of your counter-revolutionary opinions that you expressed on this private platform that they work for.
Well, counter conservative opinions. If you're threatening their capitalist corporate establishment, aren't you the revolutionary? I mean, that's Ted's point.
Yeah.
Is that these people are sellouts? I mean, fundamentally, that's what he's saying. These people are sellouts to the system, and he's right. He's right about all of that. He's right about.
well, they
a lot
like
of
the
it.
system now though because the system promotes their ideology. It's basically this.
Yeah, but keep in mind when he's writing this, though, dude. Like it was even less obvious back
No,
then. And he had
yes,
the fucking number.
that's true. But I think in the '90s, it was pretty clear this affirmative action stuff. I mean, you had the OJ trial. I mean, that was later, obviously, in his writings. But basically, the push for racial and sexual equality had been going on for quite some time. That had begun in the probably 50s even.
Well, he talks about affirmative action, and I don't have the quote in front of me, but I can easily paraphrase it. Basically what he says is that if the left were actually interested in something like racial harmony or the advancement of their little Negro pets or whatever, like he clearly doesn't give a shit about, like he doesn't buy into that religious aspect of their thing. But if they were serious about it, they would actually and genuinely court the critics of it, the white critics of it, who say that this is discriminatory against whites, etc. And the fact that they're unwilling to like talk about this or debate it, etc., or come to a conclusion that is amiable to what they say their goals are, which would be the advancement of the Negroes, shows that their interest is much less in the advancement of the Negro as it is in attacking whites. I mean, this is what he's saying. That's his argument.
Right. So while we're on the subject of like the left and really in power with this neoliberal stuff, let's be a little bit more current events about this. So it's pretty well known at this point that Facebook, Google, many of the other major tech startups, maybe Apple, probably Microsoft, definitely IBM, are all trying to develop their own artificial intelligence, right? So he has two theories where AI go. Assuming that scientists succeed in developing it, he says in that case, presumably all work will be done by vast, highly organized systems of machines, and no human effort will be necessary. Either of two cases might occur. The machines might be permitted to make all of their own decisions without human oversight, or else human control over the machines might be retained. So, assuming that machines make all of their own decisions without human control, effectively what happens is up to anyone's guess. It's too complex to really understand because no one can really predict how these machines will really act. But effectively, it means game over for humanity because there's just no way for humans to survive past this point because they've effectively lost all their autonomy. On the other, let's say that they're not totally in control of themselves, that people still control them. He says, on the other hand, it is possible that human control over the machines may be retained. In that case, the average man may have control over certain private machines of his own, such as his car or his personal computer. But control over large systems of machines will be in the hands of a tiny elite, just as it is today, but with two differences. Due to improved techniques, the elite will have a greater control over the masses, and because human work will no longer be necessary, the masses will be superfluous, a useless burden on the system. So I guess this is where we all end up with VR goggles glued to our eyelids, like that Zuckerberg image, just watching porn all day or whatever.
Has he ever commented on the reaction to him doing that? I mean, he's so sort of unaware of his own irritation or irritatingness to other people.
Now that we're talking about a disgusting tyrannical Jew, let me throw in my my 2 cents on this question. So
Yeah, and I have a quote I'd like to read afterwards. Go ahead.
So here's my quote on is number 52. He says, and this is one area in which he gets it wrong. Suppose that a public official or corporation executive appoints his cousin, his friend, or his co-religionist to a position rather than appointing the best qualified for the job. He has permitted personal loyalties to supersede his loyalty to the system. And that is nepotism, quote, or discrimination, both of which are terrible sins in modern society. Would-be industrial societies that have done a poor job of subordinating personal or local loyalty to the system are usually very inefficient. Look at Latin America. Thus, an advanced industrial society can tolerate only small-scale communities that are emasculated, tamed, and made into tools of the system. Now, here's the problem. He's correct about the system's need to destroy organic community and to destroy loyalties to things other than to the system. He's very right about that. But it sends off alarm bells in my mind, and it should you, dear listener, when he says that something like nepotism is a sin to the system, because we know damn well that nepotism of a certain group, the Jews, is completely tolerated. It's tolerated because they run this damn system in the sense that they're the ones who can benefit as a group, qua Jews, qua Jews, through the system. Other groups can benefit insofar as they are individuals who serve the system, as Ted would frame it. But there is a group that has a prime stake in the system that operates as a group. And so he misses this completely. He misses entirely one of the key questions of our age, that of the Jew. He misses this because he's not paying.
Is not unique to, like, nepotism is a universal.
Yeah, plenty of Anglos do that.
Well, I didn't say that. I didn't say nepotism was unique. I said that the system doesn't tolerate nepotism. That's what he says.
It absolutely
it does. Yes, it does.
No, it does. It doesn't among whites.
Look, Jews are just better at this. They know how to work the system. They know how to find loopholes. They're very aggressive in their own little way. And I think that explains why they're so powerful. If whites can do it, and they do in some cases, it'll happen.
There's nepotism so there's two kinds of nepotism. Nepotism that the system can't tolerate, and nepotism that serves the system. Does allowing the importation of Korean shopkeepers who behave nepotism
monolithic.
That serve the system? Yes, tolerated.
Ted from his cabin to write like a detailed exploration of like intra-elite power dynamics. Like, that's just not.
I'm not expecting that either. But my point is that
cut off. I mean, he's reading
let me
old
connect
books.
this to a broader point, which is that because of his individualistic, egoist view of the world, he obviously hasn't read his Rosenberg, right? He's not willing to recognize in these dynamics a struggle of the blood, a struggle of tribal groups. And he mentions, of course, the dynamics of racial conflict and ethnic conflict. He's aware of these. But to him, the system is an amorphous sort of Marxist force of history that doesn't have any allegiances to any groups whatsoever.
That's not his thing. It's about, well, he calls it technology. I mean, you probably are more correct in that it's sort of socialization that he doesn't like, but that's his focus. It's more about how the industrialized specialization has occurred, and you can't expect him to comment on everything, especially if there's no internet. I mean, there's just
Well, that brings it back to facts of the case as to when this thing. We don't really know when this thing was written and to whom it was first given. That will suck us back into the first half of the show. But
I think, from the NRX point of view, is this technically non or black? This idea of these kind of neoliberal in control of
Wrath of
AI
Non
systems.
Oh, non. Yeah, I mean, that's like what he's describing as the technological process is isomorphic with like the conception of like non, or of like the sort of progress of mankind. Like the guy, I guess, like who has probably the most direct of a clash. I would pay good money for a Nick Land, Ted, Uncle Ted.
Oh yeah, I would second that, Hank, bigly.
But I mean, so like that side, the sort of there's a little bit of overlap there to the sort of like quasi-transhumanist idea that like, okay, so you're not going to solve the problem of technology, quote unquote, by having VR porn and robots and whatnot. What you can do is you can like simply allow the process to continue out to like a broader sphere. Like realistically, if you stop the notion of like technology, what happens is that you just get nuked by an asteroid in a couple thousand years and game over. And it's not necessarily to say that the process of technical advancement or the will of non like leads you to a bright and happy place of like white plastic spaceships and like stargates and like banging green alien chicks. It might very well lead you to sort of something that we would recognize as incredibly dystopian. But following that path isn't even necessarily desirable. It's like literally the only path forward, because engaging with the self-reinforcing system is the only way that you can deal with the self-reinforcing system.
I don't agree that it's the only way forward. To take your asteroid example, where if we don't develop advanced anti-asteroid technology, then we're all dead in 1,000 years. Take a look at the alligator, who is essentially the last remaining dinosaur on Earth. That species has been around for millions of years, much longer than humans. So to say that a pseudo-advanced, species, and obviously more intelligent species, couldn't manage a asteroid strike, I think is probably not correct.
Well, I mean, it's pick your poison, right? Like, things definitely seem like they are on a stabilizing track in the world today. Like, I don't know that anyone looks at the immediate 5 years and is like rubbing their hands with glee, unless it's perhaps in a morose anticipatory sense.
Right, I agree.
So, I mean, like there are a few points. One of them is that like you don't necessarily have a choice. Like, this is a major weakness of Uncle Ted's work, that there is no plan, because like there can't be a plan other than like everybody stop trying to beat everybody else at the game that you've been playing for 20,000 years.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's very naive, and just come on, that's like not the nature of a
So I mean, like
organism
the
that...
person, like the best that you can do is try to do what we have been doing for 20,000 years, which is take technology and try to use it for your own ends, like both technical technologies and social technologies and their synthesis. Like, I think the Amish actually do have a pretty good handle on that, where
Sure.
they've structured their society in such a way that they tend not to be as vulnerable. They're still vulnerable, but they're not as vulnerable to sudden kind of technological shocks. And as a result, like, their society is less capable in a lot of regards. Like, they're not going to win a war against anyone.
Well, see, this is my problem, is not just the asteroid, I guess, but just like, what do you do when he says like, oh no, if Japan like is selling all the cars to the United States, what are we going to do? I mean, obviously, like, who cares if you're
tries to like straw man it, but like, it's a real concern.
No, it is if you want to be in a economy that is functioning like as it does now. But the problem, most obvious problem, is like, okay, what if you have a more technologically advanced invading power? You're going to lose, if the will is there, at least. I mean, like the Soviet Union folded under the Wehrmacht incursion because the Germans were just more technologically advanced, and also in their sort of tactics as well, which is a form of technology. And they only probably got out of it through sheer force of numbers, home territory advantage, and a lot of aid from the United States. So how do you prevent, like the Amish, like if the United States just fell apart into a huge just Yugoslavic civil war, the Amish's land would probably be taken. And how do they defend against that? I mean, I don't think they do. So that's one of the worries I have with this, like just being a Luddite thing.
One of the more bizarre aspects of what he's saying is, as he describes this surrogate process where you any kind of beyond subsistence activity is fundamentally a way of fulfilling a psychological process. I mean, that seems to be really what he's saying. Mm-hmm. He doesn't have a way of distinguishing between people like himself, people of this very high caliber of capability and intelligence, rocket scientists, to use just the tired and obvious meme, like between that and somebody who, having their needs satisfied, needs that, like someone mentioned the VR pornography or whatever, like to be hooked up to a fucking like feeding tube and a porno machine, and or to watch your Negro ball or something like that. Like, he doesn't really have a mechanism of distinguishing once you arrive past the subsistence level by which your actions are fully in your domain of autonomy, because they are immediately, they are goals that you decide, and the path to fulfill those goals is your agency. That's what I said earlier when I mentioned that there was a bizarre conflict between this kind of egalitarianism and elitism, because really it's a differentiated man, a man of a kind of even of a master morality, who that's what he wants, is he wants that, and we've seen it before. That's not is.
I think I can reconcile the two if you'll let me.
Well, we can be reconciled because, again, like I was about to say, we've seen it before. It's not the first time people talk about the early anarchist stuff. You see that in people like Bakunin. It's not, or other anarchists that came later in that tradition. He is not unique to that tradition, and I would place him in that tradition. I would place him in the tradition of Stirnerite, assuming this is his work, and I do think it is his work. However, I do think some things have been added. I don't want to think there is one little bit where it's like added in, and we've had to kill people, and I see that as something that could have easily been inserted. It didn't really go with the flow of it, but. Philosophically, just looking at the work itself, this is something out of a individualist anarchist tradition, a Stirnerite tradition. They've always had this problem, whereby they have a certain egalitarian worldview, but they're also acutely aware of certain elite dynamics that they themselves are capable of participating in. And if there was a realization of what exactly they wanted, they would again be forced with the social problem that Ted is bitching about, which is people not being able to fit into a system. I mean, that's fundamentally what it is. And there's always going to be people who fall below this threshold, who fall below what is expected of them. In a primitive society, those people are going to die.
Okay, but did you say that this cannot be reconciled, the elitism and egalitarianism? Or
no, I didn't say it couldn't be reconciled. Okay. I said that it's just it's a tension, and the way it's reconciled is through a kind of a social Darwinism.
Well, it's a tension when everybody is forced to live I mean, obviously today the globalization trend is making this very difficult, but I would argue if you have very small scale communities, you can have a form of egalitarianism and elitism, because right now we're competing against the entire planet. And it's like, if you're not at the top of your game, you're going to be replaced by somebody who works for less or for higher quality, or by a robot. But if you go back to the traditional way of most of human history, people were isolated, and their competition was the drunk down the road. But that was about it. I mean, it was like you could be an elite in your own little village. And so in a sense, the egalitarianism is all the different villages sort of existing on a very sort of level playing field. But today, everybody has to just be like, oh, how many PhDs do you have? Well, I have more. Sorry, go, work at Starbucks.
As you know, and as Ted knew, like, you can't bring this thing down. You can't bring down, especially here you are in the current year, without the mass death and the killing off of these people. Which I'm not going to make a moral judgment.
He never said that was his goal. I mean, that's partly.
No, it doesn't have to be his goal. He's smart enough to understand this very basic fact that you've created an entire mass of people who are dependent upon industrial society. That's not
industry means that there's a sort of concerted effort, and it's a specialized effort. And that's really what drives the capitalist logic. It's like this hyper-specialized, efficient system that everything has to be hooked up to because there's always a cheaper source of labor or a better source of labor somewhere in the world.
You can take the nihilist, I shouldn't say, you can take the hard-edged, I hesitate, but almost right-wing individualist viewpoint. I'm not a fan of those designations, but let's just, if we break it that way, we say the anti-humanist and the humanist feel-good version of that individualism and anarchism. If you take the side where it's, we can do the mass die-off and stuff so we can fulfill the true natural potential and destiny of the differentiated few who then could be, equals amongst themselves, et cetera, et cetera. The simple fact is that if you had some kind of aversion to the idea of killing millions of people as useless eaters, then you can't reconcile your leftist humanism with a primitivist anarchism. It's not possible. And Ted never really makes any moralistic humanist arguments. And that's why it's you're left with something, I guess, if you were saying this guy's a terrorist, like there would be no reason to preclude him from killing lots of people. Just from a philosophical standpoint, there's no end to who could be slaughtered in order to achieve the correct combination of techniques and population.
I think that's an unfair analysis of. I mean, are you putting that sort of?
Is it?
Are you putting that logic to his way of his worldview? I mean, do you think that he wants?
I'm applying his worldview to the world as it is, and I'm saying what the consequences would be.
That's your perspective.
No, we agree on this. Everyone here, everyone listening agrees that if you pull the rug out from industrial society, you have the great death.
Yes,
that's not disputed.
Okay, yes, if you pull it out, sure. But is that his? See, this is my lack of understanding, and my partial critique is that he doesn't really explain that. So I'm not going to assign anything to him if he doesn't talk about it. I would say it's an oversight on his part at most. But I would not say
I'm saying.
Yeah, I don't think it's fair to say that he sort of his advocacy would basically result in the death of millions. I would. No,
I'm not. I'm not. Again, I'm not trying to make a. We can. This is a we can close on a few. Again, he made. What makes Ted interesting is that he reacted. He's a very brilliant guy who had a very astute assessment of what the system did to control people, and then the lack of reaction to that process, to that oppression. The issue I have with Ted, and I think everyone else should have with Ted, is that his ideas are based in something that cannot really stand on its own in a meaningful way that any of us should care about. His ideas are personal psychological reaction to a admittedly hellish system. And
yes,
he understands a lot of it, but he starts to fail to understand things that are going on because he has no value beyond the highest existence of the man animal as a unit in itself.
I think that's fair. I'd like to end on his 6 principles. I'll let it stand with his own words. So this is moral philosophy if he has one, but this is what he writes. So number 1, do not harm anyone who has not previously harmed you or threatened to do so. Number 2, principle of self-defense and retaliation. You can harm others in order to forestall harm with which they threaten you, or in retaliation for harm that they already inflicted on you. 3, one good turn deserves another. If someone has done you a favor, you should be willing to do him or her a comparable favor if and when he or she should need one. Number 4, the strong should have consideration for the weak. 5, do not lie. 6, abide faithfully by any promises or agreements that you make.
I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression. Everybody's out of work or scared of losing their job. The dollar buys boss shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter. Punks are running wild in the street, and there's nobody anywhere who seems to know what to do, and there's no end to it.